In the cold nurseries of Winterfell, two infant boys sleep side by side, one born to the lord of the castle, one claimed as his shame. The world believes Eddard Stark brought a bastard home from war. His wife believes it. His king believes it. But beneath the bastard's name lies a secret that could topple the Iron Throne and end two dynasties in a single stroke. In another life, this deception holds for 14 years, carried in silence until silence is the only thing left. In this one, a father looks at his wife's grief and decides that love deserves the truth. The lie that loved. The boy was crying again. Catelyn heard him through the walls, a thin, reedy wail that carried through Winterfell's stone corridors with the persistence of something that would not be ignored. The wet nurse, a broad-hipped woman named Willa who had come north with Ned from the war, was singing to the child in a voice that held the flattened vowels of the South, and the song was unfamiliar. And the unfamiliarity of it grated against Catelyn's nerves like a blade drawn across stone. She was nursing Robb, her own son, red-haired, fat-cheeked, warm against her breast, suckling with the focused intensity of a boy who had inherited his mother's appetite and his father's stubbornness. She held him and watched the firelight move across the nursery wall and listened to the bastards crying from the chamber next door, and the sound of it was a wound that would not close. 2 years. 2 years since Ned had ridden back from the south with a baby in his arms and a name on his lips. Jon. He called the boy. Jon after Jon Arryn. And a story that was no story at all, but a silence shaped like an explanation. He had fathered a child on some woman during the war. He would not say who. He would not speak of it. The boy would be raised at Winterfell, under Ned's roof, alongside his true-born children, and that was the end of the matter. Catelyn had accepted it because she had no choice. She was new to Winterfell, new to her marriage, new to the north with its cold gods and colder customs. And the husband she had married, a stranger, a replacement for the brother she had been betrothed to first, was not a man who invited argument. Ned Stark kept his silences the way other men kept their swords, close, sharpened, and ready to cut anyone who reached for them. But acceptance was not the same as peace. The bastard's presence in her home was a splinter that worked deeper with every passing month, every meal where the boy sat at table with her children, every time a servant glanced between Robb and Jon and did the arithmetic that all servants did. Which child looked more like the Lord? Which child would grow taller? Which child carried the stronger blood? The bastard had the Stark look, grey eyes, dark hair, a long face that even at 2 years old was already shaping itself into the lean northern mould that Robb, with his Tully colouring, would never match. The crying stopped. Willa had succeeded in whatever maternal alchemy the nurse employed, and the silence that followed was more irritating than the noise, because it reminded Catelyn that the bastard was being comforted by a woman Ned had brought from the south, and the south was where the betrayal had happened, and every comfort the boy received was built on the foundation of her humiliation. She finished nursing Robb. She placed him in his crib. She stood at the window and watched the snow fall across the courtyard, fat flakes drifting through the torchlight, the hot springs sending coils of steam into the winter air, and she felt the coldness inside her that had nothing to do with the season. Ned found her there. He came through the door with his quiet northern tread, a tall man, lean, brown-haired, his face carrying the permanent expression of a man who had seen something terrible at a young age and had arranged his features around the memory. He was 22 years old. He looked older. The war had aged him the way wars aged all men who survived them, not in the body, but in the eyes, which held a depth of shadow that peacetime could not explain. "Robb is sleeping?" he asked. "He is." Ned crossed the room and looked into the crib. His face softened, the momentary thaw that only his children could produce, the brief lowering of the wall that Catelyn had learned to read as the closest thing Ned Stark came to visible joy. "I need to speak with you," he said. "About Jon." Catelyn's shoulders tightened. "What about Jon?" "Close the door." She closed it. The latch clicked. The sound was louder than it should have been, carrying the weight of a threshold that both of them were about to cross. Ned sat on the edge of the bed, His hands were on his knees, and he was looking at the floor, and the posture was wrong. Not the posture of a lord addressing his wife, but the posture of a man preparing to lift something heavier than his body could support. "Jon is not my son." The words landed. Catelyn stared at him. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. The silence between them was not the practiced silence of their marriage, the comfortable, companionable wordlessness that 2 years of shared routine had built, but a silence of a different kind entirely. The kind that exists in the space between a blade leaving a hand and the blade arriving at its target. "What did you say?" "Jon is not my son. He is my sister's son, Lyanna's child." Catelyn sat down. Not because she chose to. Her legs made the decision without consulting the rest of her. She sat in the chair beside the fire and looked at her husband, and the room tilted, gently, like a ship adjusting to a wave, and everything she had believed about her marriage and her husband and the bastard boy in the next room shifted with it. "Lyanna," she repeated. "Lyanna and Rhaegar Targaryen." The name fell into the room, and the room absorbed it as stone absorbs blood, silently, permanently, with the understanding that what had been stained could not be unstained. She was not taken against her will, Ned said. His voice was steady, but the steadiness cost him. Catelyn could see the effort in the set of his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on his own knees, the tension in a body that was holding itself together through discipline rather than ease. She went with him. They were married, before a septon in Dawn, in a ceremony witnessed by Rhaegar's Kingsguard. I found the record in the tower. They loved each other, Cat. Whatever else happened, whatever madness it caused, they loved each other. She died. In the birthing bed, in a tower in Dawn, surrounded by blood and blue roses, with 3 Kingsguard at the door and my sister's voice growing weaker with every breath. She made me promise. She made me swear on everything, on our father's memory, on the old gods, on whatever love I bore her, to protect the child. Robert would have killed him. Robert killed every Targaryen he could find. I brought the boy home and called him mine, and lied to you, and lied to the world, and I have carried that lie for 2 years, and I cannot carry it alone any longer. Catelyn's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and held them there, and felt the trembling move up her arms and into her shoulders and settle in her chest, where it became something that was not trembling but a different kind of motion, the rearrangement of everything she had built around the shape of a betrayal that had never happened. "You never dishonored me," she said. "No, you never broke your vows. Never. You let me believe. For 2 years, you let me believe that you had." Her voice cracked. The crack was anger, not grief, and the anger was volcanic and cold and aimed at the man sitting 3 feet away from her with his eyes on the floor. "You let me hate that child. You watched me look at him with... You let me treat him as if he were the proof of your faithlessness. And he is my sister's son. The last living child of Rhaegar Targaryen, the heir to the Iron Throne, if any man were foolish enough to press that claim. And the boy that Robert Baratheon will kill without hesitation if he ever learns the truth." The anger did not leave. It shifted, redirected itself from the betrayal she had imagined to the deception she had endured, from the sin Ned had not committed to the suffering he had allowed her to carry in its place. He had chosen her pain over the child's death. He had calculated the cost and decided that a wife's resentment was a price worth paying for a baby's life. And the calculation was right. She would have made the same choice had she been the one holding the secret, but the rightness of it did not make the cost smaller. Who knows? Howland Reed. He was at the tower with me. No one else. Not even Benjen. I have never spoken of this to anyone but Howland, and now you. The fewer people who know, the safer the boy is. Catelyn looked toward the wall behind which the bastard's nursery lay, the room she had avoided and resented, and walked past with the deliberate speed of a woman escaping an accusation. The boy was sleeping on the other side of that stone. Lyanna Stark's son. Rhaegar Targaryen's son. Not a bastard at all, if the marriage was real, a true-born prince. With a claim that would make him the most hunted child in the 7 kingdoms. If Robert discovers this, he will come for the boy. And for us. For harboring a Targaryen, the penalty is death. For me, for you, for Robb. Robert loves me as a brother, but his hatred for the Targaryens runs deeper than his love for anything. I have seen what he does to Dragonblood. I will not let him do it to Lyanna's child. The fire popped. A log shifted. The mundane sounds of a winter evening in Winterfell, sounds that had been the backdrop of Catelyn's new life, the rhythms of a home she was still learning to inhabit, continued as though nothing had changed, which was a lie, because everything had changed. And the lie of ordinary sounds against extraordinary revelations was one more deception in a night that was built from them. "What do you want me to do?" Catelyn asked. "I want you to help me protect him. I want you to raise him as part of this family, not as a stain on it. I am asking you to love a child who is not yours and treat him as though he were. And I am asking you to do it in secret. Without explanation, without credit, without anyone ever knowing why. You are asking me to lie. I am asking you to save a life. The lie is the cost." Catelyn stood. She walked to the wall. She placed her palm flat against the cold stone, as if she could feel the child's warmth through 2 feet of granite, and she stood there with her hand on the wall and her husband behind her, and the weight of a kingdom's worth of deception settling onto her shoulders like a cloak she had not asked to wear. She thought of Lyanna. She had never met the girl. Lyanna had died before Catelyn arrived in the north, but she had seen the statue in the crypt and heard the stories. Wild as a winter storm, beautiful as the dawn over the Wolfswood, the woman Robert had loved with an obsession that had started a war and ended a dynasty, dead at 16, with a baby at her breast and her brother's tears on her face. And the baby was in the next room. "I will do it," Catelyn said. "Not for you, for her, and for the boy who did nothing wrong except be born." She turned from the wall. Ned was looking at her, his grey eyes wet, which was a sight Catelyn had never seen and would rarely see again, because Ned Stark did not cry except in the presence of his dead, and now, apparently, in the presence of his wife's mercy. "He is ours," Catelyn said. "From this night, he is ours. But Ned, you will never lie to me again. Not about this, not about anything. If I carry this secret, I carry it as your equal, not your fool. You have my word. Your word is what got us into this. It is. And it is all I have to offer." Catelyn crossed the room and took his hands and held them, and the grip was not tender, but fierce, the grip of a woman who had just been given a burden and a gift in the same breath, and who intended to carry both with the same hands. The next morning, she went to the nursery. She dismissed Willa, gently, with silver and a letter of recommendation, and the nurse left Winterfell within the week. Catelyn lifted Jon from his crib. He was lighter than Robb, thinner, his face sharper even at 2. His grey eyes found hers, and the look in them was the look of every child who has ever stared at a face and tried to determine whether the face meant safety or danger. Catelyn held him. He was warm. His hand found the collar of her dress and gripped it with the mindless tenacity of a toddler who has found something solid in a world that offers few certainties, and the grip was small and strong and real. And Catelyn Stark, who had spent 2 years resenting a child for a crime that had never been committed, pressed her lips against the dark hair that smelled of milk and wool and said nothing, because nothing was the sound that love made when it arrived too late and stayed anyway. The change was too thingdual. It had to be. A highborn lady who despised her husband's bastard for 2 years and then reversed overnight would generate the kind of talk that travelled, from servants to stewards, from stewards to visiting lords, from visiting lords to ravens, and from ravens to the ears of men who made careers from other people's secrets. Catelyn understood this. She had been raised in Riverrun by Hoster Tully, a man who had turned political discretion into an art form, and his lessons ran deep. So the transformation was slow. She began by including Jon at meals, not at the high table, not yet, but at the same board where the Stark children ate their porridge and their bread and their honey cakes under old Nan's supervision. She ensured that Jon had warm clothes. She spoke his name without the flinch that had previously accompanied it. When the household saw these changes, they attributed them to the gradual softening of a southern bride who was learning northern customs. The North did not shame its bastards with the same ferocity as the South. And Catelyn's acceptance of Jon was seen as assimilation rather than revelation. By the time Jon was 5, the household had adjusted. The boy ate with his siblings, learned with his siblings, played with his siblings. Robb and Jon were inseparable, two boys the same age, growing at the same rate, discovering the world in the parallel exploration that only children born within months of each other can sustain. They wrestled in the yard. They chased each other through the glass gardens. They sat in the godswood and threw stones at the pool and watched the ripples collide and merge. And neither boy understood the metaphor, because they were 5 and metaphors were for adults. Catelyn watched them from the covered walkway above the yard, and the watching was complicated. Robb was her blood, tully red hair, tully blue eyes. The face of her father and her brother and her own reflection softened into boyhood. Jon was not her blood. He was Lyanna's and Rhaegar's, a child of fire and ice in the most literal sense the words possessed, and every time the light caught his grey eyes at a certain angle or his mouth set in a line that was pure Stark, Catelyn saw the dead woman whose promise she was keeping, and the dead prince whose name she could never speak. She raised him anyway. Not as a bastard, not with the grudging tolerance that bastards received even in the North, but with the attentiveness of a woman who knew what the child was and intended to prepare him for the possibility, however remote, that the world might one day demand he become it. This meant education. Catelyn ensured that Jon learned alongside Robb under Maester Luwin's instruction, reading, writing, arithmetic, history, but she added layers that Luwin found surprising. She requested that Jon study High Valyrian, the language of the Dragonlords, the tongue of Targaryen kings, a subject that no Stark bastard in the history of Winterfell had ever been taught. An unusual choice, my lady, Luwin observed. The maester was old, bald, chain-collared, his eyes bright with the intelligence that had earned him links in every metal the Citadel offered. High Valyrian is hardly a practical language for a boy raised in the North. Knowledge is never wasted, maester. If Jon is to serve his brother well, he should be educated well. A lord's right hand must be his equal in learning, if not in station. Luwin accepted this. He was a man who valued education above station, and the argument that a bastard brother educated as a near equal would be a more effective advisor to the future lord was sound enough to override his surprise. He taught Jon Valyrian alongside Robb, and Jon took to it with an aptitude that startled the old maester and did not startle Catelyn at all. Because the blood remembered what the mind did not, and the language of dragons flowed from the boy's tongue as though it had been waiting there. Catelyn also ensured that Jon learned history, all history, but Targaryen history in depth. The Conquest, the Dance of the Dragons, Jaehaerys the Conciliator, the Blackfire Rebellions. She framed it as general education. And it was general education, but the emphasis was deliberate. And the boy who absorbed the stories of his ancestors, without knowing they were his ancestors, grew up with an understanding of power and dynasty and the weight of a crown that no bastard of the North had any reason to possess. Ned watched this and said nothing. The silence between him and Catelyn on the subject of Jon's education was the silence of co-conspirators who had agreed on the plan and did not need to discuss it, a shared understanding that operated beneath the surface of their marriage like a current beneath ice, invisible and powerful and constant. Their marriage was stronger for the secret, in some ways. The shared burden created an intimacy that ordinary marriages did not possess, a partnership forged not from love alone, but from the mutual custody of a truth that could destroy them both. They spoke of Jon at night, in whispers, in the locked chamber where no servant could hear. They discussed his progress, his temperament, his growing resemblance to both his parents, Lyanna's grey eyes, Rhaegar's lean build, a combination that produced a boy who looked entirely northern until you caught him in a certain light and saw the prince beneath the bastard's name. But the secret also created a distance. There were things Ned could not say, things about the tower, about Lyanna's last hours, about the 3 Kingsguard he had fought and the 2 friends he had buried. And the unsayable things accumulated between them like snow on a roof, invisible from below but present in every creak of the timbers. Catelyn did not press. She had learned that Ned's silences were not walls, but scars, and pressing against a scar produced pain without progress. When Jon was 8, he asked about his mother. They were in the library, Catelyn and Jon and Robb, working through a lesson on the great houses and their sigils. Robb was drawing a trout, badly, with more enthusiasm than precision. Jon was watching Catelyn with the focused attention of a boy who had been working up to a question for days and had finally found the courage. "My lady," he said. He still called her that. Not mother. Never mother. Because even a loved bastard knew the boundaries, and the boundary between a lady's kindness and a mother's name was one that Jon had never crossed. "Can I ask about my mother?" Catelyn set down her pen. She looked at the boy. Dark hair, grey eyes, a face that was beginning to lose the roundness of childhood and take on the angles of the young man he would become. He looked so much like Ned. He looked so much like Lyanna. The resemblance was a knife that cut in two directions, reminding her of the family she had married into and the woman she had never met, and the promise she was keeping with every day that passed without the truth being spoken. "Your mother was a woman of great courage," Catelyn said. The words were chosen with a precision that a diplomat would have admired. Every syllable was true. "She loved you more than anything in the world. She died bringing you into it, and her last wish was that you be safe and loved." What was her name? Catelyn hesitated. This was the blade's edge, the point where truth and deception met, and the balance between them required a footwork as delicate as any swordsman's. She could not say Lyanna. She could not invent a name that might later be contradicted. She chose the only path that preserved both the secret and her oath to Ned. "That is a question for your father, Jon. When you are old enough, he will tell you everything. I promise you that." Jon studied her face. He was 8, but his eyes were older. The eyes of a boy who had grown up loved, but aware that the love was complicated, that the warmth surrounding him had been built on a foundation he could not see, and whose shape he could only guess at. "Is she alive?" "No, sweet boy. She is not." Jon nodded. He turned back to his drawing, a direwolf, rendered with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and the moment passed, but its shadow remained in the room long after the lesson ended. A shadow that had the shape of a question that Catelyn could not answer and Jon could not stop asking. Theon Greyjoy noticed things. He had been a ward at Winterfell since the age of 10, a hostage, though the word was never used. Taken from his father after the Greyjoy rebellion to ensure Balon's compliance. He was 4 years older than Robb and Jon, sharper-tongued, lean-faced, with the arrogance of a boy who had been born to rule an island kingdom and had been exiled to a frozen castle in the company of children he considered beneath him. Theon watched the Stark household with the eyes of an outsider. And outsiders saw patterns that insiders missed. "Your lady mother is fond of the bastard," he said to Robb one afternoon in the practice yard, after a round of sparring that Theon had won with ease, and Robb had lost with the cheerful stubbornness that was his natural state. "That's not common. In the Iron Islands, a lord's bastard would be lucky to eat at the same table as a thrall. Here, Snow sits with the trueborns and eats the same bread and learns the same lessons. Your mother treats him like a son. He is my brother," Robb said. He was 10, and the simplicity of the statement carried the force of a conviction that had been formed before the boy was old enough to question it. "Half-brother," Theon corrected. "There's a difference. Ask any lord in the 7 kingdoms. Blood matters. Not in this house." Theon smiled. The smile had edges. Every house says that. Every house is lying. The observation was cruel, and it was not entirely wrong, and the cruelty of partially correct observations was the most dangerous kind, because it planted seeds that grew in soil the speaker never tended. Theon had noticed Catelyn's warmth toward Jon. Others had noticed too. The question, "Why does the lady treat the bastard as though he were trueborn?" circulated beneath the surface of Winterfell's daily life like a rumor that had not yet found its voice. Maester Luwin raised the subject with Ned in the autumn of Jon's 12th year, during one of their private meetings in the Maester's turret, where the ravens roosted and the air smelled of parchment and candle wax. "The boy is remarkably well educated, my lord. His Valyrian is better than Robb's." His understanding of Targaryen history is, if you'll forgive me, excessive for a boy of his station. Lady Catelyn has invested a great deal in his instruction. My lady believes that a lord's household is strengthened by the education of all its members, Ned said. Jon will serve Robb. A well-educated servant is a better servant. Indeed, Lewin paused. The maester was not a man who challenged his lord directly, but his pauses communicated what his words did not. A gentle, persistent curiosity that operated at the frequency of academic inquiry rather than political suspicion. It is only that the education Lady Catelyn has chosen for the boy is an unusual one. High Valyrian, Targaryen genealogy, the political structure of the freehold. These are subjects one would teach a prince, not a bastard. Are you suggesting something, Maester? I am suggesting nothing, my lord. I am observing. Observation is what maesters do. Ned met Lewin's eyes. The two men regarded each other across a table covered in raven scrolls and wax seals, and the silence between them held the shape of a conversation that neither was willing to have. Observe less, Ned said, in this matter. Lewin bowed his head. He did not raise the subject again. The years passed. Sansa was born, then Arya, then Bran, then Rickon. The nursery that had held 2 boys expanded to hold 6 children, and the household grew around them, and Jon Snow grew with it, taller, leaner, darker, his face sharpening into the long northern plains that made him look like a younger version of Ned and an echo of the statue in the crypts that bore his mother's name. He was a good swordsman. Sir Roderick Cassel, the master at arms, said that Jon was the best natural blade he had trained since Ned himself, and the praise was not given lightly. Roderick was a man who measured compliments the way a miser measured coins, and the expenditure of one indicated genuine worth. Jon sparred with Robb daily, and the bouts were close and fierce and conducted with the intensity of brothers who loved each other and wanted to win and could not entirely separate the two. He was popular in Winterfell. The servants liked him. The men-at-arms respected him. Old Nan told him stories the same way she told stories to the true-born children, with the same voice, the same inflections, the same creaking affection. The small folk in Wintertown knew his name and tipped their heads when he rode through. But he was a bastard. The word followed him like a shadow, present in every formal introduction, every feast where the seating arrangements reminded the hall of what he was, every visiting lord who looked at him and saw not the boy but the label. Snow, the name of shame, bestowed on northern children whose fathers acknowledged them but whose mothers remained unnamed. Jon bore it. He bore it with a grace that Catelyn found both admirable and painful, because the grace came from the education she had given him, and the pain came from the knowledge that the burden was unnecessary, that the boy carrying the bastard's name was the most legitimate person in the castle, the true-born son of a prince and a Stark princess, hidden in plain sight like a jewel disguised as a stone. 14 years she kept the secret. 14 years of watching the boy she had raised walk through the world with half his identity sealed away, the dragon hidden inside the wolf. The prince pretending to be a bastard because the truth was a death sentence, and the lie was the only shield that stood between him and the king's fury. And then the ravens came from King's Landing, carrying news that Jon Arryn was dead and the king was riding north, and the secret that had held for 14 years began to crack. Ooh. Ooh. The truth in the crypts. Ooh. Ooh. The raven arrived on a grey morning in the last days of summer. Jon Arryn, Hand of the King, was dead. Robert Baratheon was riding north to Winterfell with his queen and his court and his Kingsguard and the full weight of the Iron Throne's expectations, and he was coming to ask Ned Stark to take the dead man's place. Ned read the letter in his solar and sat with it for a long time. The fire burned low. The afternoon light moved across the floor. When Catelyn found him, the letter was on the table, and his face held the expression of a man who had just been handed a problem with no clean solution. "Robert is coming," she said. She had heard from Lewin already. "He wants you. He wants a hand. He wants you." Ned looked at her. The unspoken thought moved between them, the same thought, arriving at the same moment, with the same cold weight. "Jon," Catelyn said, "Robert cannot be in the same castle as that boy without the risk increasing beyond anything I am prepared to accept. Robert's hatred for the Targaryens is not political. It is personal. It lives in his blood. He looks at Targaryen children and sees threats, and his response to threats has never been subtle. Then we send Jon away before Robert arrives. To the Umbers or White Harbor, or no. Sending Jon away would raise questions. Why is the bastard being hidden? Robert would notice. Cersei would notice. Littlefinger has spies in every castle in the north. The safest place for Jon is here, in plain sight, beneath Robert's notice. Bastards are beneath the king's notice. Then what? Then I tell Jon the truth. Before Robert arrives. Before the boy stands in the same hall as the man who killed his father and has no idea why the sight of the king fills him with a dread he cannot name. Catelyn's hands tightened in her lap. They had discussed this moment, when to tell Jon, how to tell Jon, what words to use, 100 times over the years, in the late-night whispers that constituted their private language. They had never agreed on a timeline. Ned wanted to wait until Jon was a man grown. Catelyn wanted to tell him before the world told him first, in a way they could not control. The arrival of the king forced the issue. "He is 14, she said. Old enough to fight. Old enough to die. Old enough to know who he is. Is he old enough to keep the secret?" Ned was silent. The question was the crux, the fulcrum on which everything balanced. A 14-year-old boy learning that he was the son of a dead prince and the heir to a stolen throne. Could he hold that knowledge inside himself while standing 3 feet from the man who would kill him for possessing it? "I raised him," Ned said. "You raised him. He is the best of both of us, and neither of us. He can hold it. And if he cannot, then we die. All of us. And the secret dies with us, and Lyanna's sacrifice was for nothing." The conversation ended. The decision was made that evening as the sun dropped behind the wolfswood and the castle settled into the routines of supper and prayer and the endless small tasks of a household preparing for a royal visit. Ned went to find his nephew. Jon was in the practice yard with Robb, sparring with blunted steel. The 2 boys, the same age, the same height, as different as fire and water, and as close as 2 branches of the same tree, circled each other with the focused aggression of young men who had been training together since they were old enough to hold a sword. Robb was stronger. Jon was faster. The bout ended with Robb on his back in the mud, and Jon standing over him with the blunted blade at his throat and a grin that made him look, in that instant, exactly like the boy Ned remembered Lyanna being. "Jon, walk with me." The grin faded. Jon read something in Ned's face, not alarm, but gravity, the weight of a man carrying a conversation he had rehearsed 1,000 times and was about to deliver once. He set down the practice sword and followed his uncle into the castle. They went to the crypts. The stairs descended into darkness, a spiral of stone steps worn smooth by centuries of Stark feet, leading down into the earth beneath Winterfell, where the dead kings and lords and ladies of the north rested in their granite alcoves with their iron swords and their stone wolves. The air was cold and dry and smelled of dust and the absence of sunlight. And the torches that Ned lit at the entrance cast shadows that moved along the walls like ghosts too restless to stay in their tombs. They walked in silence, past Brandon the Builder, past Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt, past the long procession of Stark ancestors whose names Jon had learned from Maester Luwin, and whose faces the sculptor had carved from grey granite with varying degrees of skill and fidelity. They stopped at Lyanna's statue. She was younger than the other statues. Her face was smooth where theirs were weathered, her features distinct where theirs had been softened by the erosion of centuries. The sculptor had given her a beauty that was both stark and something else, a wildness in the set of her mouth, a challenge in the angle of her jaw, a quality that the stone preserved but could not fully capture. Blue winter roses lay at her feet. Ned replaced them weekly, and the sight of fresh flowers in a crypt full of dust and darkness was a contrast that Jon had noticed before but never questioned. because some things about Ned Stark were simply accepted, rather than examined. "Do you know who she is?" Ned asked. "Lyanna Stark. Your sister. She died during Robert's rebellion. The prince took her, and she died. Rhaegar did not take her. She went with him." Jon looked at Ned. The torchlight moved across both their faces, and in the underground light the family resemblance between them, the resemblance that the world attributed to father and son, was stark and misleading, and layered with a truth that was about to rewrite everything the boy believed about himself. "What do you mean?" Lyanna loved Rhaegar. Rhaegar loved Lyanna. They married in secret, before a septon in dawn, and they lived together in a tower in the mountains of the Red Keep's shadow, the Tower of Joy it was called. Robert's rebellion was fought on a lie, the lie that Rhaegar stole her. He did not steal her, she chose him. "Why are you telling me this?" Ned reached out and placed his hand on the statue's base. His fingers rested against the cold stone, and the gesture was the gesture of a man touching something that was both a monument and a wound. Lyanna died in that tower. She died giving birth to a son, a boy with grey eyes and dark hair and Stark blood and Targaryen blood, born in the last days of a war that had been fought to avenge a wrong that was never committed. She named him, and she held him, and she made me swear on everything I held sacred, to protect him from Robert, from the world, from anyone who would harm a child for the crime of being born. Jon's breathing changed. It went shallow, quick, the breathing of an animal that has sensed danger but cannot identify its source. "I brought that boy home to Winterfell," Ned said. "I called him my bastard. I gave him a name, Jon, after Jon Arryn, the man who raised me. I let the world believe he was my shame, because my shame was a lesser evil than his death." The crypt was silent. The torches hissed. The dead watched from their alcoves with stone eyes that had seen centuries of Stark secrets carried into the dark. Jon's face was the face of a person falling, not physically, not visibly, but internally, the floor beneath his understanding giving way, and the drop beneath it immeasurable, and the landing uncertain. "You are Lyanna's son," Ned said. "Rhaegar Targaryen was your father. You are not my bastard. You are my nephew. You are the true-born son of a prince and a princess, and you carry a name that would make you the most wanted man in the Seven Kingdoms if anyone outside this crypt ever heard it." Jon took a step backward. His shoulders hit the wall of the alcove behind him, and the contact was the only thing that stopped his retreat. Because the alternative was to keep walking backward until the crypt ran out of corridor and the darkness swallowed him. That's not possible. It is the truth. I swear it on my father's bones, which lie 20 feet from where you stand. You're my father. I am your uncle. I have loved you as a father, raised you as a father, and I would die for you as a father. But the blood in your veins is not mine. It is Lyanna's. It is Rhaegar's. And the world that we live in would kill you for it. Jon slid down the wall. He sat on the cold stone floor of the crypt with his back against the alcove of some ancient Stark king, and his knees drawn up and his hands gripping his own forearms as though holding himself together, and the expression on his face was not shock. Shock was too simple a word for what was happening behind his eyes, but something closer to dissolution. The coming apart of a self that had been built on a foundation that had just been revealed as a fiction. Ned sat beside him. Not across from him, beside him, shoulder to shoulder, in the dark, in the cold, among the dead. The posture was deliberate. It said, "I am not standing above you. I am here with you. This is not a lord's command. This is a family's truth." "Catelyn knows," Ned said. "She has known since you were 2. Everything she has done for you. The education, the languages, the history. She did it because she knew what you were and wanted you to be ready if the world ever demanded it." Jon made a sound, not a word, a sound, raw and involuntary. The sound of a boy whose understanding of his own mother had just undergone a second revolution in the space of 3 minutes. Catelyn was not the kind woman who had inexplicably accepted a bastard. She was the woman who had known the truth and had spent 12 years preparing a prince for a kingdom he could never safely claim. She raised me because you are her husband's sister's son, and she loved you, and she is a better woman than I deserved. And all the times I called myself Snow, and the other boys mocked me, and I stood in the yard and bore it, because that was what bastards did. You stood there and watched, and said nothing. And you knew. I knew, and it was the hardest silence of my life. Every day. 14 years. 14 years. Jon put his head against the wall. The stone was cold against his skull. Above them, Winterfell continued its business. The sounds of the household filtered through layers of earth and granite, reaching the crypts as a distant hum that might have been the castle breathing. What am I supposed to do with this? Nothing. Not yet. You are supposed to know who you are, and you are supposed to keep it locked inside yourself until the time comes to use it, or until the time comes to bury it forever. The secret has kept you alive for 14 years. It must keep you alive for longer. Robert is coming. Robert is coming. He killed your father on the Trident. He gave the order that resulted in the deaths of your half-siblings, Rhaenys and Aegon, murdered in the sack of King's Landing. He would kill you without a heartbeat of hesitation. You must stand in the same hall as this man, and smile and bow and be the bastard. And the effort may be the hardest thing you have ever done. Jon closed his eyes. The darkness behind his lids was the same darkness that filled the crypt, and the two darknesses merged into a single black space in which the shape of his life, the shape he had understood, the shape he had lived inside for 14 years, was being replaced by a different shape, larger and more dangerous and more real. Who else knows? Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch, no one else in the living world. And now you. What about the proof? You said there was a marriage. Where's the record? Ned reached beneath his cloak. He withdrew a leather pouch, old and cracked, and opened it. Inside was a folded parchment, thick, yellowed, bearing a wax seal that had cracked with age, but whose impression was still legible, a three-headed dragon. This is the Septon's record of Rhaegar and Lyanna's marriage. I found it in the tower, in a chest beside the bed where your mother died. There is also a harp, Rhaegar's harp, silver-stringed, hidden in a compartment behind the wall of this alcove. He tapped the stone behind them. The proof exists. It has always existed. I keep it here because the dead are the best keepers of secrets. Jon took the parchment. His hands were trembling. He unfolded it and read the words, formal, archaic, written in a hand that was not Ned's, and the words confirmed what Ned had told him, and the confirmation was worse than the telling, because words could be doubted, but documents were real. He folded it. He gave it back. He stared at the floor. Does this mean I'm the heir to the Iron Throne? By the laws of succession, if the Targaryen claim were recognized, you would be the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, ahead of Viserys, ahead of his sister, ahead of every living person. But the Targaryen claim was ended by Robert's warhammer. The dynasty was overthrown. The throne was taken by right of conquest. Your claim exists in law and in blood. But it exists in a world that would sooner kill you than crown you. So it means nothing. It means everything. It just cannot be spent. Not now. Perhaps not ever. But knowing who you are, that matters. You are not a bastard. You never were. The world calls you Snow because I gave you that name, and I gave you that name to save your life, and every morning you woke up carrying it was a morning you woke up alive. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the dead and the dark and the weight of a revelation that had changed nothing about the world outside the crypt and everything about the world inside the boy sitting on its floor. Catelyn was waiting when they emerged. She was standing in the corridor outside the crypt entrance, a tall woman, auburn-haired, composed, her hands folded in front of her in the pose that Jon had seen 1,000 times, and that he now recognized as armor rather than habit. She looked at Ned. She looked at Jon. She saw the answer in both their faces. "Come," she said. Not to Ned, to Jon. "Come with me." She led him to her chambers. She sat him down. She poured wine, watered, the way she served it to the children, and she sat across from him and looked at him with eyes that held 14 years of unspoken context. You have questions. Did you hate me? Before you knew? The directness of it rocked her. She had prepared for a dozen questions about Lyanna, about Rhaegar, about the political implications and the succession and the danger, and instead, the boy had gone straight to the wound that mattered most. I resented you, she said. She would not lie to him. Not now. I believed you were the proof of your uncle's unfaithfulness, and I treated you as proof rather than as a person. I was wrong. I was wrong for 2 years, and then your uncle told me the truth, and I have spent 12 years trying to repay the debt. You taught me Valyrian. Yes, and Targaryen history. Yes, you were training me. I was preparing you. Not for the throne, I never expected you to sit on it, but for the knowledge of who you are, so that when this day came, when you learned the truth, you would already have the tools to understand it. Jon looked at her. His grey eyes, Lyanna's eyes, Ned's eyes, the Stark eyes that ran through the bloodline like a river through stone, were raw and wet and held the expression of a boy who was seeing a woman he had known his whole life for the first time. Thank you, he said. The words were simple and insufficient, and they were all he had. Catelyn reached across the table and took his hand. The grip was the same grip she had used to hold his collar in the nursery 12 years ago. Firm, warm, the grip of a woman who had made a promise in the dark and had kept it in the light. You are mine, she said. Whatever your name, whatever your blood, you are mine, Jon. The years I raised you were not a duty. They were a choice. And I would make the same choice again. Outside the window, a raven circled the tower and landed on the sill. The bird was from King's Landing. The king was 3 weeks from Winterfell. Jon Snow, who was not Jon Snow, who had never been Jon Snow, who was a name he did not yet know and a claim he could not yet speak, sat in Catelyn Stark's chambers and held the hand of the woman who had raised him as a prince without ever calling him one, and the weight of who he was settled onto his shoulders like a crown made of iron and ice and silence. The king, in Winterfell, Robert Baratheon arrived with the pomp and appetite of a man who believed the world existed to feed him. The royal procession stretched for half a mile along the King's Road, wheelhouses and supply carts and outriders, and a column of Lannister crimson that turned the winter landscape into something that looked like a wound. Jon watched from the upper battlements. He had positioned himself above the yard, beside a gargoyle whose stone face had been worn smooth by 3 centuries of wind. And from this height the king's arrival was a spectacle reduced to geometry. The line of the column, the arc of the banners, the rectangular mass of the wheelhouse as it passed through the gates. Robert dismounted in the yard. He was fat. Jon had expected this. The songs called him the demon of the trident, the Warhammer king. But the man who climbed down from his courser was not the warrior of the songs, but a ruin built on the warrior's foundation, thick-waisted, red-faced, his breath coming hard from the effort of a dismount that should have been effortless. His eyes, though, his eyes were still the eyes of a man who had killed a prince. Rhaegar, my father. Robert killed my father. The thought arrived with a clarity that was almost physical, a pressure behind Jon's eyes, a tightness in his hands. He gripped the stone of the battlement and held it until the pressure subsided into something he could contain. And the containing was the hardest thing he had done in the 14 years of his life. Because the man standing in the yard below was laughing and embracing Ned and slapping his back, and the sound of the laughter was the sound of a man who had destroyed a dynasty and built a kingdom on the rubble and called it justice. Jon descended. He took his place at the edge of the yard, behind Robb, behind Sansa, behind Bran and Rickon and Theon, in the position that bastards occupied at formal occasions, present, visible, unimportant. He bowed when the king's shadow passed over him, and Robert's eyes slid across him the way a man's eyes slide across furniture, registering the presence without engaging the person. And the dismissal was a gift, because notice would have been dangerous. The feast that evening was everything a royal feast required. roasted meats and honeyed bread and wine from the arbor, and the noise of 300 people in a hall built to hold half that number. The sound bouncing off the stone walls and the timber ceiling and the smoke blackened rafters until conversation became competition and laughter became assault. Jon sat at the lower end of the hall, near the doors, where the drafts came in and the torchlight flickered, and he ate and drank and watched the king with the focused attention of a boy studying the man who would kill him if the truth were spoken. Robert drank. He drank as a man who has been doing it for decades drinks, steadily, without ceremony, the cup rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of a habit that had long since stopped requiring thought. Between cups, he talked, loud, profane, generous with his opinions, and careless with his language, a man whose authority permitted him to say things that would have earned a lesser man a punch. He told stories about the war, about the trident, about the moment his hammer found Rhaegar's breastplate and the rubies scattered like a dynasty being shattered one jewel at a time. "The bastard went down," Robert said, his voice carrying across the hall the way a thunderclap carries across a field. "Went down in the river, face first, and the water ran red for 20 yards downstream. Best thing I ever did. Best thing anyone ever did." Jon's hand closed around his cup. The metal bent beneath his grip. Beside him, Robb glanced over, a quick, sidelong look that said, "What's wrong?" And Jon released the cup and shook his head, and the moment passed. He endured the feast. He endured the stories. He endured 3 hours of Robert Baratheon celebrating the murder of his father, and the endurance was a crucible that burned away something inside him and replaced it with something harder. Not hatred, which would have been simple, but the controlled, disciplined fury of a boy who had learned to carry a secret and was now learning to carry a grievance alongside it. After the feast, in the corridor outside the Great Hall, Jon encountered the Queen. Cersei Lannister was standing with her twin brother, Ser Jaime, the Kingslayer, golden-haired and golden-armored, and wearing the white cloak of the Kingsguard with the casual arrogance of a man who had earned his title by killing the king he was sworn to protect. They were speaking in low voices, their heads close together, and the intimacy of the posture was striking, too intimate for siblings. Too private for a public corridor. Jon walked past. Cersei's green eyes found him, and the look she gave him was the look a cat gives a mouse that has wandered into its territory, not hungry, not threatened, but aware. "The bastard," she said. Not to Jon, to Jaime, in a voice that was pitched to carry. How alike they look. "I wonder about the mother." Jaime said nothing. His eyes lingered on Jon's face, a brief, assessing glance that took in the dark hair and the grey eyes and the lean Stark features, and then moved on, dismissing what it had assessed with the efficiency of a man who had calculated a threat level and found it negligible. Jon kept walking. His heart was hammering. The encounter had lasted 10 seconds, and the 10 seconds had contained more danger than any sparring bout or riding mishap of his life. Because Cersei Lannister was not a woman who observed without calculating, and her calculation of the boy who looked like Ned Stark but was not Ned Stark's son was a calculation whose conclusion Jon could not predict. 3 days later, Bran fell. The tower was the broken tower, the one that Bran climbed despite every prohibition, the one whose crumbling stairs and missing battlements made it irresistible to a 7-year-old boy whose ambitions exceeded his body's capacity to satisfy them. He went up. He did not come down. He was found at the base of the tower by the kennel master, who heard the impact and came running and found a broken boy on the frozen ground and shouted for help with a voice that cracked the morning silence like an axe cracking wood. The household fragmented. Catelyn went to Bran's bedside and did not leave. Ned went silent, the deep, sealed silence of a man processing grief and fury simultaneously and finding room for neither. Robb took on the duties of acting lord with a gravity that aged him 10 years in a day. The Stark children drew together as children do when catastrophe strikes, tighter, more dependent, their individual orbits collapsing into a single huddled mass of fear and confusion. Jon stayed close to Robb. The two boys, men, nearly, by the standards of their world, sat together in the hours after Bran's fall and said little, because grief did not require speech, and the companionship of brothers required even less. Jon brought food to Catelyn's chamber. He organized the kennels and the stables and the small tasks that Robb was too distracted to manage. He made himself useful as he had always been useful, steadily, without fanfare, filling the gaps that others left. And beneath the utility, beneath the grief, the secret burned. Jon looked at Bran's broken body and saw a 7-year-old boy who would never walk again. And the injustice of it was absolute, and the rage he felt was the rage of a brother, regardless of what blood ran in his veins. Robert left Winterfell a week after Bran's fall, taking Ned with him. Sansa went south. Arya went south. The household thinned, and the castle felt larger without them. Larger and emptier and colder, as though the removal of 6 people had altered the building's temperature in a way that stone and fire could not compensate for. Ned's farewell to Jon was private. They met in the Godswood, before the heart tree, with the carved face watching from the weirwood's white bark and the pool reflecting the red leaves above. "Guard the north," Ned said. "Guard your brother. Guard yourself. When will you tell me to stop hiding?" The question was not planned. It erupted from the place where 14 years of secrecy had been compressed into a pressure that was becoming unsustainable. And the eruption surprised both of them. "When hiding is no longer the thing that keeps you alive," Ned said. "When the cost of the secret outweighs the cost of the truth, that time has not come. When it does, you will know." "How?" Ned put his hand on Jon's shoulder. The weight of it was the weight of every lesson he had taught, and every lie he had told, and every night he had spent in the crypts beside Lyanna's statue, speaking to the dead about the living child he was raising in her name. "Because you are a Stark, and you are a Targaryen, and both of those things, in their own way, know how to endure." He mounted his horse. He rode south. Jon stood in the courtyard and watched him go, and the last sight he had of the man who had raised him was a straight back and a grey cloak disappearing through the gates of Winterfell, heading toward a city that would consume him. They never spoke again. The young wolves. Ooh. 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 The war came in pieces. First, the raven from the Eyrie, Lysa Arryn's letter, delivered by Maester Luwin, accusing the Lannisters of murdering Jon Arryn. Catelyn read it, and her face went pale, and she took Luwin to her private chambers and was not seen for the rest of the day. And when she emerged the next morning, she was composed and deliberate and operating with the controlled precision of a woman who had decided that the situation required her to be 3 things at once: mother, lady, and strategist. Then, the attack on Bran, the catspaw with the Valyrian steel dagger, killed by Bran's direwolf, Summer, whose fangs found the assassin's throat with an efficiency that left the room bloody and Catelyn's hands bandaged from the blade she had caught. The dagger was Valyrian steel with a dragonbone hilt, a weapon too rich for a common cutthroat, and the identity of its owner pointed south, toward gold and lions and the family whose power rested on the throne that Catelyn's nephew had a claim to, though the connection was one she did not make aloud. Catelyn left for King's Landing. She rode south to warn Ned, taking Sir Roderick with her, and the departure left Winterfell in the hands of Robb and Jon and Maester Luwin and the garrison. And the weight of the castle settled onto the boy's shoulders like a physical thing. The responsibility of walls and gates and granaries and 1,000 small folk who depended on the Stark name for their safety. Jon did not go to the wall. In another life, a life where Catelyn resented him and the household offered no path forward, he might have taken the black and joined the Night's Watch and disappeared into the cold. In this life, the Watch was not an option. He knew who he was. He knew what the wall meant. An oath that could not be broken. A lifetime spent at the edge of the world. A surrender of every claim and every possibility. Catelyn had spent 12 years preparing him for something larger than a frozen wall. And the preparation had taken root, and Jon Snow remained at Winterfell. News from the south arrived in fragments, each raven carrying a piece of a picture that was growing darker with every message. Ned had arrested Tyrion Lannister. No, Catelyn had seized Tyrion on the road. The Lannisters were mobilizing. Tywin's armies were gathering in the west. Sir Gregor Clegane was burning the Riverlands. Then the worst, Ned had been arrested, accused of treason. Thrown into the cells beneath the Red Keep by the boy King Joffrey, whose right to the throne Ned had challenged, and whose response was the response of a child with a crown and a grudge, and no one with the authority or the courage to stop him. Robb called the banners. The northern lords answered. They came from every holdfast and castle and mountain tower in the north. Great Umber with his massive frame and his louder voice. Roose Bolton with his pale eyes and his quiet calculations. Rickon Karstark with his sons and his sunburst banner. Mage Mormont with her mace and her daughters. Galbart Glover and Robert Glover, and the Talharts and the Serwyns and the Dustins, and all the others. The feudal machinery of the north, grinding into motion with the slow, heavy inevitability of a glacier advancing down a valley. 12,000 men gathered at Winterfell. Another 3,000 joined on the march south. The army moved down the King's Road in a column that stretched for 2 miles, and at its head rode Robb Stark, 15 years old, auburn-haired, armoured, with grey wind at his side, and the weight of the north on his shoulders, and the fear of inadequacy in his chest, and the furious, burning need to save his father, driving every step. Jon rode beside him. The bastard, as the lords still called him, occupied a position that was not quite commander, and not quite advisor, and not quite anything the northern hierarchy had a word for. He was Robb's shadow. He rode where Robb rode, ate where Robb ate, slept in the tent beside Robb's tent, attended every council, and said little. When he spoke, it was to Robb's ear, in whispers that the other lords could not hear, and the whispers carried weight because Robb listened to them with the attention of a man who trusted the speaker without reservation. The lords noticed. The Grachon, who had tried to draw his sword on Robb at the first war council and had his fingers bitten off by grey wind for the trouble, observed Jon with the blunt assessment of a man who valued strength above all else. The bastard fights well, he told Robb after a sparring session. Fights like a wolf, fast, doesn't waste a stroke. He fights like a Stark, Robb said. Aye, more's the pity he wasn't born one. Others were less generous. Roose Bolton, whose pale eyes missed nothing, and whose voice carried the flat, bloodless quality of a man speaking about meat, commented to no one present that a bastard at the war table was a sign of either desperation or indulgence, and neither was becoming in a lord. Jon absorbed the commentary. He had spent 14 years absorbing commentary about his station, and the absorption was a skill, the ability to hear the insult, file it, and continue functioning without visible response. The skill was more valuable now than it had ever been, because the insults were not about a bastard's place in a hall, but about a bastard's place in a war, and the stakes were measured in blood rather than embarrassment. The twins loomed out of the flatland of the Riverlands like a pair of grey teeth. Lord Walder Frey, 90 years old, sharp as a blade, sour as vinegar, controlled the crossing with the possessive malice of a man who had built his entire life around a single strategic advantage and intended to extract maximum payment from anyone who needed it. The negotiations were brutal. Walder wanted a marriage, Robb to a Frey girl, one of the dozens who populated the castle like rabbits in a warren. The price of crossing was a pledge, sealed by betrothal, that the next Lord of Winterfell would take a Frey to wife. Robb accepted. He stood in Walder Frey's hall and pledged himself to a bride he had not met, and the pledge was political and necessary and hateful. And Jon watched from the back of the hall and kept his mouth shut, because the bastard's opinion on his brother's marriage was not a thing the world wanted to hear. They crossed. The army split, half north to Moat Cailin under Roose Bolton, half south toward Riverrun under Robb. The strategy was Jon's, whispered in the tent the night before the crossing: divide the force. Send a feint to engage Tywin at the Green Fork while the main army swings west and hits Jaime Lannister's siege of Riverrun from behind. 2,000 men will march into Tywin's teeth, Jon said. He was pointing at the map, his finger tracing the line of the King's Road south from the twins. They will not win. They cannot win. But they can hold Tywin's attention long enough for us to reach Riverrun and break Jaime's siege. 2,000 men is a butcher's bill, Robb said. It is, But if we march all 15,000 into Tywin's path, we lose more. His army is larger, better equipped, and commanded by a man who has been winning wars since before our fathers were born. We cannot beat him in a straight fight. We can outthink him. Robb looked at the map. He looked at Jon. He saw in his brother's face the same quality that Catelyn had spent 12 years cultivating. The ability to assess a situation without sentiment and recommend a course of action that was correct and costly, and did not flinch from the cost. Bolton leads the feint, Robb said. We take the main force west. The Whispering Wood earned its name. The forest west of Riverrun was dense, old-growth oak and elm, thick canopy, the kind of terrain that swallowed cavalry and amplified infantry, and turned a numerical disadvantage into a tactical advantage for anyone smart enough to use the trees. Robb used the trees. He placed his archers in the canopy and his infantry among the roots and his cavalry on the single road that wound through the wood. And he waited for Jaime Lannister to ride into the trap with the golden arrogance that made him the most dangerous and most predictable swordsman in the Seven Kingdoms. Jaime came. He rode with his guard, 200 mounted knights, the flower of the Lannister West, armoured and caparisoned and carrying the lion banner as though the banner itself were a weapon. They entered the wood at a trot, and the wood closed behind them, and the trot slowed to a walk, and the walk stopped when the first volley of arrows came down from the canopy like iron rain. The battle lasted 40 minutes. It was not a duel, it was a massacre conducted with surgical precision, the northern archers dismounting and degrading the Lannister column while the infantry closed the road behind, and the cavalry charged from the front, and the compression crushed the Lannister knights into a space too small to swing a sword and too dense to turn a horse. Jon fought. He fought in the cavalry charge, the first real combat of his life. The first time he swung a blade at a man who was trying to kill him and felt the blade connect, and felt the resistance, and felt the thing on the other end of the blade stop being a person and become a body. The transition was instantaneous and irreversible, and the sound of it, the crunch, the gasp, the thud, stayed with him long after the battle ended and the blood dried and the wounded stopped screaming. Jaime Lannister was captured. The Kingslayer, golden, bloodied, defiant even in defeat, was pulled from his horse by 3 Karstark men and thrown to the ground, and his sword was taken, and his hands were bound, and the fury in his green eyes was the fury of a man who had never been beaten, and whose pride could not accommodate the experience. Jon looked at him. The man who had killed the Mad King, the man whose twin sister had borne children by incest and placed a bastard on the Iron Throne, the man whose family had murdered Rhaegar's other children, Rhaenys, a girl of 3, and Aegon, a babe in arms, killed by Gregor Clegane and Amry Lorch on Tywin's orders. Jon's half-siblings. Murdered. He turned away. The rage was there. A constant, controlled burn behind his sternum. But the rage was not something he could afford to express, because expressing it would require explaining it, and explaining it would require the truth, and the truth was a weapon he was not yet ready to draw. The victory at the Whispering Wood was followed by the relief of Riverrun and the capture of the Lannister supply train and the general collapse of the Lannister position in the Riverlands. Robb was a hero, the young wolf, the lords called him, and the name spread through the camp and the countryside, and the rumours that travelled ahead of the army like advanced scouts for a reputation. And then, the raven came from King's Landing. Ned was dead. He had been executed on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor by order of Joffrey Baratheon, by the sword of Cerilyn Payne. He had been promised mercy. The Wall, the Black, the forswearing of all claims and titles, and the promise had been broken by a boy king who valued cruelty over strategy, and whose mother's protests had been overridden by the same petulant, vicious impulse that would define his reign until its end. The raven's message was brief. The grief was not. Robb received the news in his tent at Riverrun. He read the scroll. He read it again. He set it down. He stood. He walked to the tent's entrance and stood with his back to Jon and his hands at his sides, and his shoulders shook. Once, twice, and the shaking was the last involuntary motion he would allow himself before the composure of command closed over the boy beneath it like ice closing over water. Jon read the scroll over Robb's shoulder. The words were small and black and final, and the meaning of them was the end of a man and the beginning of a war that could not now be stopped by negotiation or compromise or any force short of the total destruction of one side or the other. He had loved Ned. Uncle, not father. The distinction was legal and genetic and irrelevant, because the man who had raised him and taught him and held his secret for 14 years and sat beside him in the crypts and told him the truth was dead, killed by a boy whose claim to the throne was a fraud and whose authority was built on the same lie that Jon's entire life had been built to conceal. The grief hit. It hit the way a hammer hits, from outside, without warning, with a force that compressed everything inside him into a single point of white-hot pain. He went to his tent. He closed the flap. He sat on his cot and put his head in his hands, and the grief poured through him like a river through a broken dam, and the sound he made was the sound of a boy losing a father for the second time. First in the crypts, where the word father had been replaced by the word uncle, and now in the tent, where the man himself had been replaced by absence. Catelyn arrived at Riverrun the next day, brought from the twins by Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. She had heard the news on the road. Her face was the face of a woman who had processed grief at speed and arrived at the other side in a state that was not recovery, but functioning. The ability to move and speak and make decisions while the wound beneath was still open and bleeding. She found Jon before she found Robb. She came to his tent, and the visit surprised him. Because in the hierarchy of grief, a mother's son came before a mother's nephew, and Robb was the one who needed her. "I need to talk to you," she said, "before I talk to Robb. Before anyone." She sat on the camp stool. Her traveling cloak was muddied at the hem, and her hair was unwashed, and her eyes were red-rimmed and dry, past tears, past the luxury of visible sorrow. Operating in the hard country beyond grief where decisions were made and consequences were faced, Ned is gone. The secret now belongs to 3 living people. You, me, and Howland Reed. No document, no harp, no proof matters if there is no one alive to authenticate it and no lord willing to believe it. She leaned forward. "Jon, you must not reveal yourself. Not now. Not during this war. I wasn't planning to. I need you to hear me say it, because the temptation will come. Robb is about to be named something. The lords are calling for it, king in the north, independent, separate from the Iron Throne. If Robb is king, your claim becomes a complication. If you reveal yourself, you are not just a Targaryen. You are a Targaryen inside a northern army led by a northern king whose authority depends on the north being independent of the Targaryen dynasty. I would never challenge Robb. I know that. The lords do not. To them, you would be a rival claimant wrapped in a Stark body. And the politics of rival claimants in the middle of a war are the kind of politics that end with someone dead." Jon met her eyes. The woman looking at him was the woman who had held his collar in the nursery and taught him Valyrian and fed him history and loved him with the stubborn, deliberate love of a person who had chosen to do so when every instinct of her upbringing told her otherwise. "I will keep the secret," he said. "Ned, my uncle kept it for 15 years. I can keep it for as long as it needs keeping. Thank you." She stood. She straightened her cloak. She went to find Robb, and the sound of her footsteps fading down the corridor was the sound of a woman walking from one child to the next, carrying the same grief and the same strength, and apportioning both as the situation demanded. That night, in the great hall of Riverrun, the northern lords declared Robb Stark king in the north. The Grachan drew his sword first. "There sits the only king I mean to bow my knee to," he roared, and the words were a spark dropped into kindling that had been building for 300 years. The northern independence that Torrhen Stark had surrendered when he knelt before Aegon the Conqueror. The identity that had been submerged beneath 3 centuries of Targaryen rule and Baratheon rule, and was now erupting with the volcanic force of a people who had been told for too long that they were a province rather than a kingdom. The king in the north. The shout went up from 100 throats. Swords were drawn. Men knelt. The hall shook with the stamping of boots and the pounding of fists on tables, and the sound of a nation being born in a room that smelled of smoke and spilled wine. Robb stood. He looked at the kneeling lords. He looked at his mother. He looked at Jon, who stood behind the high table in the shadows, the bastard, the half-brother, the secret prince, and the look that passed between them carried the weight of a conversation they could not have in this room, and would have in a tent later that night, when the hall was empty and the lords were sleeping, and the two boys who were not quite brothers and not quite what the world believed could speak without the performance that public life demanded. Jon did not kneel. He stood in the shadows and watched his brother crowned, and the crown was invisible, no circlet, no diadem, just the voices of men declaring a king. And the invisible crown was heavier than any gold, because it was made of expectation and obligation and the terrible, grinding responsibility of leading 30,000 men against the richest lord in the Seven Kingdoms. He was proud of Robb. And he was afraid. Not of the war, of the secret. Because the boy the northern lords had just crowned king was not the man with the strongest claim in the room. And the man with the strongest claim was standing in the shadows and saying nothing. And the nothing was a silence that could not hold forever. The burden of blood. The war settled into the grim rhythm that all wars eventually find. Not the exhilarating rhythm of early victories, but the grinding, repetitive cadence of supply lines and scouting reports and councils that lasted past midnight and days that began before dawn, and the constant, draining awareness that somewhere beyond the next ridge or river, an army led by the most ruthless lord in the Seven Kingdoms was waiting. Tywin Lannister did not pursue. That was the first surprise. After the defeat at the Whispering Wood and the collapse of the siege at Riverrun, the conventional wisdom, the wisdom of the Greatjon and Lord Karstark and most of the northern lords who had cut their teeth on northern warfare, where pursuit was reflex, was that Tywin would rally and attack because Tywin Lannister did not accept defeats. And the Lannister army was still the largest and best equipped force in the field. Instead, Tywin retreated to Harrenhal. He pulled his forces behind the massive, broken walls of the ruined castle and sat there, waiting, watching, gathering intelligence, letting time and distance and the northern army's supply problems do the work that a frontal assault might have failed to do. The strategy was patient and infuriating and effective, because an army that could not find its enemy could not defeat its enemy, and the Lannisters' gold bought food and loyalty at a rate that northern silver could not match. He is waiting for us to make a mistake, Jon told Robb during one of their late-night councils in the Solar at Riverrun, where the maps were spread across Lord Hoster Tully's table and the candles burned low and the room smelled of wax and cold stone. Every day we sit here costs us more than it costs him. He feeds his army from the Westerlands and the Reach. We feed ours from the Riverlands, which his raiders have been burning since before we arrived. In 3 months, we starve. In 6, we dissolve. Then we attack Harrenhal. Harrenhal has never been taken by storm. Aegon burned it with dragonfire. We don't have dragonfire. Then what do you suggest? Jon leaned over the map. His finger traced the line of the Gold Road, the route from Casterly Rock to King's Landing, the artery that carried Lannister gold to the capital. We don't need to take Harrenhal. We need to cut Tywin off from his base. If we send a force into the Westerlands, not to hold territory, just to raid and burn, Tywin has to respond. His gold comes from those mines. His grain comes from those fields. Threaten them, and he comes out from behind his walls. Robb studied the map. The plan was bold, and it was risky, and it was the kind of strategy that could win a war or lose an army, and the line between the two outcomes was the width of a blade. Bolton is at the Green Fork with 4,000 men, Robb said. If we send the main force west, we leave the Riverlands exposed. Tywin sees us move and comes south while our backs are turned. Then we leave Bolton to hold the Riverlands. He has enough men to delay Tywin. He doesn't need to win, he needs to hold. And if Bolton doesn't hold? The question hung in the air. Jon looked at Robb and saw the thing that Catelyn's education had trained him to see, the political undercurrent beneath the military surface. Bolton's loyalty was not a settled matter. The man was obedient. He was competent. He followed orders with the cold efficiency of a man who valued power above cause. But obedience under favorable conditions was not the same as loyalty under pressure, and the pressure of being left to face Tywin Lannister's army with 4,000 men while the king marched west was the kind of pressure that revealed the difference. "Bolton will hold," Jon said. He did not believe it with certainty, but the alternative, keeping Bolton close, under supervision, while the war stalled, was worse. You could not win a war by guarding your own generals. Robb rode west. The campaign in the Westerlands was everything Jon had hoped and feared: swift, destructive, demoralizing to the Lannister cause. A blade driven into the enemy's heartland that drew blood and attention, and forced Tywin to choose between his position at Harrenhal and the defense of his home. The northern army burned and raided and took 3 minor castles and ambushed a Lannister column at Oxcross, and the victory at Oxcross was total. The Lannister force scattered, its commander killed, its baggage train captured, and Robb's reputation grew with each report that reached the capital and the court and the rest of the realm. But the victories came with costs. Men died, supply lines stretched thin, the Westerlands fought back, not with armies but with ambushes and poisoned wells and peasant uprisings that made every village a potential trap. The northern lords who had marched south to rescue their lord's father were growing restless, because their lord's father was dead, and the rescue had become a war, and the war had become a campaign, and the campaign was taking them further from home with every passing week. And then Theon went to the Iron Islands. Robb sent him. The decision was military. The Greyjoy fleet could be an asset, and Theon's relationship with his father Balon could be the bridge that brought it to the northern cause. The decision was also political. Theon was a ward, essentially a hostage, and sending him home was a gesture of trust that could pay dividends. Jon argued against it. He came to Robb's tent the night before Theon's departure and made his case with the focused intensity of a man who could see a disaster forming and was trying to stop it. Theon is Balon Greyjoy's son. Balon's last rebellion cost him 2 sons and a kingdom. He has spent 9 years nursing that grievance. You are asking him to ally with the family that holds his son hostage, against a family that had nothing to do with his defeat. Where is the incentive? Theon says his father will listen to him. Theon says what Theon wants to believe. He has spent 9 years at Winterfell trying to be a Stark, and he has never succeeded, and the failure has made him desperate. Desperate men go home and tell themselves that home has been waiting for them, and home has not been waiting. Home has been planning. Robb's jaw tightened. Theon is my friend. Theon is your ward. There's a difference, and the difference is what happens when the choice is between your friendship and his father's approval. Robb sent Theon anyway. The decision was Robb's to make, and Robb made it, and the making of it was the first clear divergence between Jon's counsel and Robb's instinct. And the divergence would cost them more than either of them could have calculated. Theon sailed for Pike. He arrived to find a father who despised him for becoming a Greenlander, and a sister who outranked him in their father's esteem. Balon Greyjoy listened to Robb's proposal and rejected it with the contemptuous dismissal of a man who had been waiting 9 years for exactly this kind of opportunity. The North undefended, its army 1,000 miles from home. Its castles garrisoned by old men and boys, and the confidence that no one would be foolish enough to attack a kingdom whose lord was winning a war in the south. Theon took Winterfell. He sailed with a handful of ships and took the castle with the ease of a man walking through an open door. Because the door was open, the garrison was skeletal, the defences undermanned, the gates unguarded by anything except the assumption that the Ironborn would never strike this far inland. The Raven reached Robb at the crag in the Westerlands on a day when the rain was falling and the news was falling harder. Winterfell had been taken. Bran and Rickon were hostages. The castle that had been the Stark seat for 8,000 years was flying the Greyjoy Kraken. Robb read the message, and his face went white. Not red, white, the colour that northern men turned when the emotion was too deep for anger and too cold for grief, and the only response the body could manage was the draining of blood from the surface. Jon read it after him. The rage that followed was different from any rage he had felt before. Not the controlled burn that he had carried since learning about Rhaegar's death, but an immediate, visceral, present-tense fury directed at a single, identifiable target. Theon had taken his home. Theon had put his brothers in danger. Theon, who had eaten Winterfell's bread and sparred in Winterfell's yard and slept under Winterfell's roof for 9 years, had betrayed every bond of guest right and hospitality and basic human decency for the approval of a father who did not love him. "I told you," Jon said. The words were quiet, and they were cruel, and they were out of his mouth before he could stop them. And the look on Robb's face, the look of a man being told that his worst mistake was predicted by the person he trusted most, was a look that Jon would remember and regret for years. "That helps nothing," Robb said. "No, it doesn't. What helps is a plan. Send me north with 500 men. I will take Winterfell back. You cannot take Winterfell with 500 men. Theon has fewer. He took the castle with 30. The Ironborn hold it, because no one has challenged them. Challenge them and they fold. They are raiders, not garrison soldiers. They know how to take and burn. They do not know how to hold." Robb shook his head. "I cannot spare 500 men. Not with the Westerlands campaign still in progress. Not with Tywin at Harrenhal. Not with Bolton." He stopped. The name hung in the air. "Bolton? Bolton has men at the Dreadfort," Jon said. "His bastard, Ramsay, has forces in the area. If we send word to Bolton, he can dispatch his son to retake Winterfell. I do not trust Bolton's bastard. Neither do I. But we have no other option. They sent the Raven. The decision was wrong. They both sensed it. In the way that soldiers sense the wrong turn on a road and take it anyway because every other road is blocked. Ramsay Snow marched on Winterfell. What happened next arrived in fragments. Theon was betrayed by his own men. The Ironborn opened the gates. Ramsay entered and the details were unclear, because the ravens that followed were Bolton ravens, not Stark ravens, and Bolton ravens carried Bolton versions of events. Winterfell burned, whether by accident or design, the ancient castle, the seat of the Starks, the home that Jon had grown up in, the halls where Catelyn had raised 6 children and kept a secret for 14 years, was put to the torch. Bran and Rickon were reported dead. The news broke something in Robb. Not visibly, the young wolf did not break where men could see it, but internally, in the deep structure of his confidence and his judgment. He had sent Theon. He had sent Theon despite Jon's warning. The consequences were his, and the weight of them was the weight of 2 brothers who were reportedly dead because their eldest brother had trusted the wrong man. And in the wreckage of his confidence, in the guilt and the grief and the rage, Robb Stark did the one thing that Jon could not prevent and Catelyn could not undo. He married Jane Westerling. The girl was a minor lord's daughter from the Crag, pretty, kind, utterly irrelevant to the war except for one catastrophic fact: she was not a Frey. Robb had bedded her after taking the Crag, in the night after the news about Winterfell arrived, when his judgment was compromised by grief and his body sought comfort in the only form available, and the honor that Ned had drilled into him demanded that he marry the girl he had bedded, and the honor overruled the political calculation that should have stopped him. He broke his pledge to the Freys. He broke it in the most public and humiliating way possible, by marrying another woman, a Western girl, a nobody, in preference to the family whose bridge he had crossed and whose price he had promised to pay. Jon learned of the marriage after the fact. He stood in the corridor outside Robb's chambers at the Crag and listened to the Blackfish tell him what had happened. And the Blackfish's face was the face of a man delivering a tactical assessment of a disaster. "The boy has handed the Freys a grievance," Brynden Tully said. "A legitimate grievance. Walder Frey is a man who collects grievances the way other men collect coins, and this one is gold. He will not forgive it. He will not forget it, and he will not let it pass without extracting a price that makes the original offense look like a courtesy. Can we repair it? A marriage for Edmure, perhaps? A Tully-Frey match to replace the Stark-Frey match? We can try." Edmure would accept. He is a man who does what his family requires, and if his family requires a Frey wife, he will smile and endure. But the insult is to Walder's pride, and Walder's pride is the one currency he values above gold. A replacement marriage will not erase the insult. It will only delay the reckoning. Jon went to Catelyn. She was in her chambers at Riverrun, where she had returned after the Westerlands campaign, and her face when he arrived told him that she had already heard. He married the girl. He married the girl. Catelyn sat down. She poured wine and drank it in a single swallow, which was not her habit, and which communicated the depth of her distress more clearly than any words. "Your uncle raised him to be honorable," she said, "and Robb's honor has now become the thing most likely to destroy him. A bedding is a sin. A sin can be forgiven, but breaking a pledge to a lord whose bridge you crossed, that is not a sin. It is an insult, and in Westeros, insults kill more men than swords. What do? We offer Edmure. We grovel. We give Walder Frey every concession we can afford, and some we cannot. And we pray, to the old gods and the new, that Walder Frey is greedier than he is vengeful." They made the offer. Edmure Tully would marry a Frey. The wedding would take place at the Twins, in Walder's own hall, with the full pageantry that the original marriage would have commanded. The price was high. Edmure Tully, Lord Paramount of the Riverlands once Hoster died, married to a Frey daughter of Walder's choosing. It was a prize that should have satisfied any lord's ambition. Walder Frey accepted. He accepted with the theatrical graciousness of a man whose smile contained teeth, and the acceptance was too smooth, too easy, too willing, and the willingness raised flags that Jon noticed, and Catelyn noticed, and the Blackfish noticed, and no one could prove were anything more than an old man's desire to see his daughter wed well. "Something is wrong," Jon told Catelyn in the privacy of her solar, where the door was barred and the fire was low, and the conversation was the kind that could not be held in public. Walder accepted too fast. The insult was real. The reparation should have required more haggling, more concessions, more of the petty humiliations that Walder Frey lives for. Instead, he agreed within the day. Why? Because the wedding gives him something better than concessions. It gives him the Northern Army inside his walls. The implication landed. Jon stared at her. Catelyn stared back, and her face held the expression of a woman who had arrived at a conclusion she wished she hadn't, and was now living with the weight of it. "You think he means to betray us?" "I think Walder Frey is a man who has survived 90 years by never forgiving a slight and never missing an opportunity. A wedding at the Twins puts Robb and his lords under Frey hospitality. Guest right should protect them. But guest right is only as strong as the man who grants it, and Walder Frey's word is the thinnest metal in the Seven Kingdoms. Then, we don't go. If we don't go, the alliance with the Freys collapses. We lose the crossing. We lose the only reliable route between the North and the Riverlands. Tywin will exploit the gap within a fortnight. And if we go and Walder betrays us, then we die." The silence after that was brief, sharp, compressed. The silence between a question and an answer that had already been determined. "Then we go," Jon said. "But we go prepared." The Crannogman's truth. Or, Howland Reed came to Riverrun on a grey evening in the 10th month of the war. He arrived without fanfare, a small man on a smaller horse, accompanied by 2 Crannogmen whose names no one asked and whose faces no one remembered. He wore the green and brown of the neck, his dark hair was streaked with grey, and his eyes held the quality that all men who had been to the Tower of Joy carried. The weight of a memory too significant to share and too heavy to set down. He was announced to Catelyn by Maester Vyman. Catelyn received him in Hoster Tully's solar, her father's room, now hers in all but title. The old lord dying slowly in the chamber above, and the war dying or growing in the fields below. Howland stood before her and did not bow, not from disrespect, from familiarity. He had met Catelyn twice before, both times at Winterfell, both times in Ned's company, and the bond between them was the bond of people who shared a secret that no one else on earth fully understood. My lady. Lord Reed, you've come a long way. I've come because the time for coming has arrived. I have heard about Lord Eddard. I have heard about the war, and about Winterfell, and about the boy king on the Iron Throne. And I have heard things from the neck, things that concern the future of every living soul in the Seven Kingdoms. The others? Howland's eyebrows rose. You know. Ned spoke of them, in whispers, late at night, when the wine made him honest. He said the wall was built for a reason, and the reason had not gone away. The reason is coming back. My children, Jogan and Mira, have the green sight. Jogan dreams, and his dreams have weight. He has dreamed of cold and darkness, and a wall of ice cracking like thin glass. I did not believe him. Then the reports from the Night's Watch began, dead men walking, cold winds from the far north, rangers disappearing beyond the wall. The watch is undermanned and underfunded and led by a man who lacks the authority to command the help he needs. And you believe this is connected to Jon. Howland looked at her. The look was the look of a man assessing whether the person before him was ready for the conversation he had come to have. I believe that the boy your husband raised is more than a political complication. I believe Rhaegar knew something about prophecy and blood and the convergence of ice and fire, and that his marriage to Lyanna was not impulse, but design. I believe Jon is part of whatever Rhaegar foresaw, and I believe the North cannot face what is coming with a king who does not know his own brother's nature. You want me to tell Robb. I want us to tell Robb. Together, with proof, he produced a bundle from beneath his cloak, leather-wrapped, old, creased with age and travel. Inside was a second copy of the marriage record, not the one Ned had hidden in the crypts, but a duplicate, kept by the Septon who had performed the ceremony and sent to the Isle of Faces for safekeeping before the sack of King's Landing. Howland had retrieved it years ago, on one of his rare journeys beyond the Neck, and had held it against a day when holding it was no longer sufficient. Catelyn took the document. She unfolded it and read it, and the words were the same words she had seen on the copy Ned had shown her 14 years ago. The names, the vows, the witnesses, and the confirmation of what she already knew landed with the dull weight of redundancy. Because knowing and proving were different stages of the same long walk, and she had been walking it for half her life. We tell Robb tomorrow, Catelyn said. After the morning council. In private. Just the three of us. You, me and Jon. Not Jon. Why not? Because Robb needs to hear the truth from his mother and from the man who was there when Jon was born. If Jon is in the room, Robb's reaction will be shaped by Jon's presence, by the need to perform, to be the king, to manage the situation. If Jon is absent, Robb can react as a brother. He can be angry, he can grieve, he can be confused. He needs that space before the political reality of Jon's identity takes it away. Catelyn considered this. Howland was right. The politics could wait. The brotherhood could not. They told Robb the next morning, in the solar, with the door barred and the windows shuttered and the fire burning low. Robb sat in his father's chair, a high-backed seat of dark oak that Hoster Tully had occupied for 40 years, and that Robb occupied now with the uncomfortable authority of a young king borrowing furniture from a dying lord. He wore his crown, the bronze and iron circlet that the northern smiths had forged at Riverrun, the ancient crown of the kings of winter, heavy and plain, and carrying the weight of 8,000 years of northern sovereignty on the brow of a boy who was not yet 16. Catelyn stood before him. Howland stood beside her. The silence that preceded the revelation was the kind that exists in the heartbeat before a surgeon cuts, the stillness of necessity, the brief peace before the blade. Robb, Catelyn said, what I am about to tell you is the most important thing you will ever hear, and it is also the most dangerous. Your father knew it. I have known it for 12 years. And the man standing beside me has known it since the day it began. Robb's eyes moved between his mother and the crannogman. His hand, resting on the arm of the chair, tightened. Go on. Jon is not your father's son. He is your father's nephew, the child of your Aunt Lyanna and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, born in the Tower of Joy in the last days of Robert's rebellion. Your father brought him home and called him his bastard to protect him from Robert, who would have killed any child with Targaryen blood. Rhaegar and Lyanna were married, legally, before a septon, with witnesses. Jon is not a bastard. He is the true-born heir to the Iron Throne. Robb did not move. He sat in the chair with his hand on the arm and his crown on his head and his face locked in an expression that was not shock, but the precursor to shock. The brain's momentary refusal to process information that it recognizes as true, but cannot yet integrate into the structure of existing reality. Jon knew. Your father told him before Robert's visit. Jon has carried the secret since. My mother told him before Robert's visit. No, Ned told him. I knew already. I have known since Jon was 2. 12 years. Robb's voice was flat. Not angry, flat, the way a blade is flat before it turns. You knew for 12 years. Jon knew for a year. My father knew from the beginning. And no one, not one of you, told me we could not. You are my mother, and he was your father, and Jon is your brother in every way that matters, and the secret protected all of you. If Robert had discovered Jon's identity, the consequences would have reached beyond Jon. They would have reached the entire Stark family. We kept it to protect you. You kept it to control me. The accusation landed like a slap. Catelyn flinched. A visible, involuntary reaction that betrayed the depth of the blow, because the accusation was partially true. Control was not the intent, but control was the effect. A king who did not know his own brother's bloodline was a king whose decisions were shaped by incomplete information, and incomplete information was a form of control, whether it was intended as such or not. Robb, Howland Reed said. His voice was calm, the calm of a man who had waited 15 years for this conversation and had rehearsed it in his mind more times than he could count. Your father made a promise to a dying woman. He kept it with his life. He told your mother to protect Jon from her resentment. He told Jon to protect Jon from Robert. He did not tell you, because telling you would have placed an unbearable burden on a boy who was already carrying the weight of being heir to Winterfell. The decision was not about control. It was about love. Was it love when Jon stood beside me at the Whispering Wood and said nothing? Was it love when he watched the lords crown me king in the north and kept his mouth shut about a claim that supersedes mine? Was it love, or was it strategy? Both, Catelyn said. It was both, Robb. Love and strategy are not opposites. They are two hands working on the same problem. Jon loves you. He chose to stay silent because revealing himself would have destroyed your coalition. He chose your kingship over his birthright. That is not betrayal. That is sacrifice. Robb stood. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to them, and his hands on the sill and his head bowed, and the crown on his brow caught the grey light from outside and threw a faint, cold gleam across his auburn hair. Send him in, Robb said. Jon entered the solar the way a man enters a room where he expects to be judged, straight-backed, steady, his face composed into the mask that 14 years of bastardry and 1 year of concealed royalty had taught him to wear. He looked at Robb's back. He looked at Catelyn's face, which told him everything. He looked at Howland Reed, whom he had never met, but whose name he knew from the story Ned had told him in the crypt. Lord Reed. Your Grace. The title froze the room. Howland had used it deliberately. Your Grace, the form of address reserved for a king, spoken to a boy who was not wearing a crown and was not sitting on a throne, and whose claim to the title rested on a marriage document and a bloodline and the testimony of a man who had been present at his birth. Jon flinched. Don't call me that. It is what you are. It is what I was born to be. It is not what I am. I am Jon Snow. I am Robb's brother. I am a soldier in the Northern Army and a bastard in the eyes of every lord in the 7 kingdoms, and I intend to stay that way. Robb turned from the window. The brothers faced each other across the solar, the boy king in his crown and the hidden prince in his plain leather, and the distance between them was 6 feet of stone floor and a lifetime of shared experience, and a secret that had warped every inch of both. You knew, Robb said. When we rode south together. When we fought at the Whispering Wood. When you held my sword arm steady after Oxcross, because the shaking wouldn't stop. You knew, and you said nothing. I said nothing, because telling you would have served no one. Not you, not me, not the North. It would have served the truth. The truth serves whoever controls it. If I had told you, told anyone, the truth about my blood, every lord in this army would have recalculated. Some would have wanted to use me as a weapon. A Targaryen claim to throw against Joffrey's fraud. Others would have wanted me dead. Because a Targaryen in a northern army is a complication that northern independence cannot afford. And some, the Boltons, the Karstarks, the men who already question why a bastard sits at the War Council, would have used it to undermine you. And you decided all of this on your own. I decided it with Mother. The word came out before Jon could stop it. Mother, not my lady. The word he had never used publicly, because the boundary between a lady's kindness and a mother's title had always seemed too important to cross. But the boundary had been an illusion, and the illusion had been maintained by a secret that was now in the open. And in the open, the word was simply true. Catelyn's eyes filled. She did not speak. The word, mother, spoken by the boy she had raised for 12 years as the most significant and most unacknowledged act of her life, landed on her with a weight that no title or honor or political achievement could match. Robb saw it. He saw the tears in his mother's eyes, and the word that had produced them, and the history that the word contained. 12 years of secret motherhood, 12 years of raising a prince as a bastard and loving him as a son while the world saw only duty. And the sight cracked something in his anger that the arguments had not reached. You are my brother, Robb said. I am. You are also, apparently, the rightful king of the 7 kingdoms. I don't want it. Wanting it is not the issue. Having the claim is the issue. Your claim exists whether you pursue it or not. And the existence of that claim, even unspoken, even hidden, changes everything about this war. It changes nothing unless we let it. We can't control who learns it. Lord Reed is here. His crannogmen know. Servants talk. Ravens are intercepted. The truth will come out, Jon. It always does. The only question is whether it comes out on our terms or someone else's. The room was still. The fire hissed. Outside the window, the sounds of Riverrun, the river, the garrison, the distant hammer of the smithy, continued with the indifference that the world showed to revelations that happened behind closed doors. What do you want to do? Jon asked. Robb looked at him. The anger was still there. Jon could see it, a red thread running beneath the surface of the king's composure. But it was being managed, controlled, redirected from personal grievance to political calculation. Robb was learning, in real time, the lesson that every king eventually learned, that personal feelings were a luxury that crowns did not permit. I want you to stay, Robb said. I want you to keep the secret. For now, we cannot reveal your identity before we deal with the Freys and the Boltons and the 1,000 other fires that are burning around us. But I want no more lies between us. Not one. Not ever. Agreed. And when this war is over, if we survive it, we will decide together what to do with the truth. Your claim. My kingship. The future of the North. We decide it together, as brothers, not as rivals. Jon crossed the room. He extended his hand. Robb took it, and the handshake was the handshake of 2 men who had fought together and bled together and discovered that the bond between them was stronger than the blood that had tried to divide it. Catelyn watched from the corner. Howland stood beside her. The crannogman's face held the expression of a man who had carried a secret for 15 years and had just watched it land in the hands of people who might be strong enough to bear it. Your father would be proud, Howland said softly. Catelyn wiped her eyes. My husband is dead. My home is burned. My youngest sons are, maybe dead. My daughter is a hostage in King's Landing. My son is a king at war. And my nephew is a prince in hiding. And the world is falling apart around us. She straightened her back. She lifted her chin. "And I will hold it together, Lord Reed. Because that is what Ned asked me to do, and I have never broken a promise to him, and I do not intend to start." The red feast that never was. They rode for the twins on a morning of cold rain, and the rain did not stop for 3 days. The army moved slowly, 8,000 men and their supply train, stretching across the riverlands in a column that took half a day to pass any given point. The losses at Oxcross and the Crag and a dozen smaller engagements had thinned the ranks, and the desertion that followed the news of Winterfell's fall had thinned them further, and what remained was an army of men who had been at war for the better part of a year, and who showed it in the lean lines of their faces and the dull, patient endurance with which they marched through mud that sucked at their boots and wheels and hooves like a living thing. Robb rode at the head of the column with grey wind beside him, the direwolf's grey fur dark and matted with rain. The crown sat on his brow beneath the hood of his cloak, and the weight of it, always noticeable, always present, the physical reminder of a title that no Stark had claimed in 300 years, seemed heavier in the rain, as though the water had settled into the iron and bronze and added the mass of the sky to the mass of the kingdom. Jon rode beside him for the first hour, and then fell back to ride with the rearguard, where the Manderley men and the mounting clansmen formed the trailing edge of the army, and where the tactical position offered the best vantage for identifying pursuit. He did not explain the move, and Robb did not question it. They had developed, in the months since the revelation at River Run, a language of unspoken coordination, a division of labour that neither had designed but both maintained, Robb taking the visible positions and Jon taking the shadows, the king and his hidden brother covering the front and the back of the same animal. Catelyn rode in the column's centre, surrounded by Tully men and the remnants of Robb's personal guard. She watched the countryside pass, the burned farms and stripped orchards and empty villages that were the landscape of a war zone, and she thought about the twins. She had been thinking about the twins for weeks. The problem was not the wedding. The problem was not even Walder Frey, though Walder Frey was a problem in the way that gangrene was a problem, persistent, spreading, and capable of killing you if you ignored it long enough. The problem was the arithmetic. Catelyn had spent 12 years performing the arithmetic of survival, calculating risks, measuring loyalties, assessing the gap between what people said and what people did, and the arithmetic of this wedding did not balance. Robb had broken his pledge to marry a Frey daughter. He had married Jane Westerling instead, a Western girl of minor house and no strategic value. And the insult to Walder Frey was precisely the kind of insult that Walder Frey never forgave. Because it was not merely an insult to his house or his honour, but an insult to his vanity, and Walder Frey's vanity was the largest organ in his body. Edmure's offer, Edmure Tully, Lord of Riverrun, the most eligible unmarried lord in the Riverlands, presented as a substitute groom for whichever Frey daughter Walder chose, was designed to repair the breach. And Walder had accepted. He had accepted without significant negotiation, without the weeks of insulting counteroffers and petulant demands that were Walder Frey's standard diplomatic technique. He had accepted as if the offer were generous, as if Lord Edmure Tully were a prize, as if the exchange of a king for a lord paramount were a fair trade rather than a humiliation. Walder Frey did not accept fair trades. Walder Frey accepted advantages. He wants us inside his walls, Catelyn said to Jon on the second evening, when the army was camped along the Green Fork and the rain had paused long enough for a conversation that did not require shouting over the weather. They stood apart from the main camp, near a copse of elm trees where the ground was firmer and the firelight from the camp reached them as a distant glow, rather than a direct illumination. "I know," Jon said. Guess right is a custom, not a guarantee. It depends on the honour of the host, and Walder Frey's honour is a conditional asset at best." Catelyn looked at him. The boy, the young man, who stood before her bore little resemblance to the infant she had taken from the wet nurse's arms 12 years ago. Jon was taller than Robb now, lean where Robb was broad, with Ned's long face and Ned's grey eyes, and beneath them, something that was not Ned's, a watchfulness, a calculating patience that came from growing up as two people simultaneously, the bastard and the prince, the visible face and the hidden truth. What do you suggest? Jon had already thought about it. He had been thinking about it since the raven from the twins arrived, and the plan he had assembled was not elegant, but it was thorough. And thoroughness, in Jon's experience, was more reliable than elegance. We go. We have to. Refusing the wedding now would shatter the alliance with House Frey entirely, and we need the twins. The crossing is the only reliable path between the north and the Riverlands, and controlling it is the difference between a war we can sustain and a war we lose to logistics. But we go prepared. I want 50 men inside the feast hall who are armed beneath their feast clothes, knives, short swords, anything that can be concealed under a doublet. I want 100 more in the camps outside the walls who are not drinking, who are not celebrating, who are armored and mounted and ready to move on a signal. I want Grey Wind inside the hall with Robb, not kennelled outside. And I want someone watching the Frey garrison, counting movements, tracking rotations, noting any deployment that does not match a normal wedding. Walder will expect a certain level of compliance. He will expect us to enter his hall as guests, not as an occupying force. Then we give him the appearance of compliance. The 50 men in the hall are in feast clothes. They look like guests. The 100 outside are part of the normal camp security. Grey Wind goes where Robb goes. That's established behavior, not a provocation. The only thing that changes is our readiness. We walk in smiling. We sit down smiling. We eat his bread and salt smiling. And if everything goes well, we leave smiling, and Edmure has a wife, and the alliance holds. And if everything does not go well, then we are 50 armed men in a hall full of Freys who expected unarmed guests. And the difference between massacre and survival is whether the weapons are on our side of the table or theirs. Catelyn was silent. The plan was sound, defensive, proportional, deniable if nothing went wrong. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of plan that Ned would have considered beneath his honor and that she would have implemented anyway. Because honor and survival were not always compatible, and when they conflicted, Catelyn chose survival. There is another consideration, she said. Bolton. The name dropped between them like a stone into still water. Roose Bolton's forces were left to hold the Riverlands while we raided the Westerlands. He has been operating independently for months. His correspondence with Robb has been correct, precisely correct. Formally correct in the way that a man is formally correct when he wants the record to show compliance regardless of what he is doing behind the correspondence. You don't trust him. Your father didn't trust him. Bolton men fight well and die obediently, and their lord watches from a distance, and that combination has never produced loyalty. It produces calculation. Jon nodded. He had met Roose Bolton twice, once at the Whispering Wood, where Bolton's pale eyes had studied Jon with the unsettling attention of a man measuring livestock, and once at the council where the Western campaign was planned, where Bolton had argued against the strategy with logic that was flawless, and a tone that was bloodless, and an underlying resistance that had nothing to do with military tactics and everything to do with the fact that the strategy was Jon's and Jon was a bastard and Roose Bolton did not take strategic direction from bastards. I'll have Daisy Mormont watch him, Jon said. She has her mother's instincts and her own eyes, and she dislikes Bolton on principle, which means she'll be looking for reasons to confirm the dislike. Put her at the feast, near the door. If Bolton's men move, she'll see it. The plan was set. Catelyn added her own provisions. She arranged for Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, to remain outside the castle with the reserve forces, giving the command structure redundancy in case the feast went wrong. She also arranged, through careful conversation with Edmure, for her brother to be drunk at the wedding. Not actually drunk, but appearing drunk. Because a man who appeared drunk was a man who appeared harmless. And a man who appeared harmless was a man who could move through a crisis without being targeted first. They arrived at the twins on the morning of the 4th day. The castle was exactly as Catelyn remembered, twin fortresses straddling the Green Fork, connected by the bridge that was the Freys' only real asset and the source of all their power. The walls were grey and squat and functional, without the grandeur of Winterfell or the beauty of Riverrun, built for control rather than display. Built by a house that had never aspired to greatness, but had always aspired to leverage. Walder Frey received them in his hall, seated in his chair on the platform where he held court and dispensed the grudging hospitality that passed for lordship at the twins. He was ancient, 90 years old, his body a collection of grievances held together by spite and sinew. And he looked at Robb with the expression of a man who had been insulted and was now being offered compensation that he considered inadequate but intended to accept. "The king in the north," Walder said. His voice was the voice of dry paper tearing. "Come to honor his word. Or what's left of it. Lord Walder." Robb's voice was steady, courteous, carrying none of the contempt that Catelyn could see coiled behind his eyes. He had learned, from Jon, from Catelyn, from the brutal education of a year at war, to separate his face from his feelings, and the separation was convincing. "I thank you for your hospitality, and for the honor you do my uncle, Lord Edmure." "Honor?" "Yes," Walder sucked his gums. "Your uncle. A lord paramount for a king. A fair exchange, some might say. Others might say I'm being cheated twice. Others might say Lord Edmure Tully is one of the most eligible lords in the Seven Kingdoms, and any daughter of yours who weds him becomes Lady of Riverrun. Aye, any daughter." Walder waved a spotted hand. "Roslyn. You'll have Roslyn. She's the pretty one. The rest look like me, and I know what I look like." The bread and salt came. Thick bread, dark and heavy, and a bowl of salt that was grey with impurities. Guest right, offered and accepted. The ancient custom that placed host and guest under mutual obligation. The obligation of the host to do no harm. The obligation of the guest to respect the hospitality. The bread was stale. The salt tasted of iron. Catelyn ate both, and felt nothing. Not safety, not reassurance, not the protection that guest right was supposed to confer. She felt only the weight of the knife strapped to her thigh beneath her gown, the steel edge pressing against her skin with each step, the cold geometry of preparation. The wedding ceremony was held in the sept within the castle, a small, damp structure with 7-sided walls and candles that guttered in the draught from the river. Roslyn Frey was pretty, prettier than Catelyn had expected. A slender girl with auburn hair and a gentle face that trembled between hope and terror, and Catelyn felt a stab of sympathy for the girl who was being married to a man she had never met as part of a political transaction that had nothing to do with her happiness and everything to do with her father's wounded pride. Edmure, to his credit, was kind. He spoke the words with genuine warmth. He cloaked Roslyn with the Tully colours, the red and blue, and when the Septon declared them married, he kissed her gently, and the girl's trembling eased by a fraction. And the fraction was enough. The feast followed. The great hall of the twins was larger than the sept, but not by much. A long, low-ceilinged room with heavy pillars and narrow windows, and a gallery above where musicians played. The Frey household filled most of the benches, sons and grandsons and great-grandsons and their wives and their children. The sprawling dynasty that Walder had produced through sheer persistence and the mathematical advantage of outliving multiple wives. Robb's men were seated among them. Catelyn counted 52 Stark men inside the hall, including the ones Jon had positioned. They wore feast clothes, clean tunics and brushed leather, and beneath the tunics they carried what Jon had instructed them to carry. Short blades, the kind that could be drawn from a belt or a boot in the time it took to overturn a table. Grey Wind was not in the hall. That was the first wrong thing. Catelyn noticed it when she looked for the direwolf and found the space beside Robb's chair empty. She caught Robb's eye. He shook his head, a small, tight motion that said he had tried and been refused. Lord Walder insisted the beast stay in the kennels. Robb murmured when Catelyn reached his side during a gap between courses, said his dogs were frightened. Grey Wind is not a beast. Grey Wind is your protection. I know, Jon already has someone at the kennel. Small Jon Umber. If I need Grey Wind, the Small Jon will bring him. Catelyn returned to her seat. She watched the hall. She watched the musicians in the gallery, 5 men with instruments, their faces half hidden by the gallery rail. She watched the Frey men at the lower tables, noting which ones were drinking and which ones were not. She watched Roose Bolton, who sat at the far end of the high table with a cup of water. Water, not wine. and a face that displayed no more emotion than a stone wall. Bolton was not drinking. At a wedding feast, surrounded by celebration, Roose Bolton was drinking water. The bedding was cooled. The tradition, loud, bawdy, theatrical, required the guests to carry the bride and groom to their chambers, stripping them of clothing along the way, and shouting suggestions that ranged from crude to creative. Edmure and Roslyn were swept up by the crowd, Roslyn blushing furiously and Edmure grinning with the determined good humor of a man who had been coached by his sister to make the best of his situation. As the bedding procession left the hall, the doors closed behind them. Jon was not in the hall. He had excused himself before the bedding was called, murmuring about checking the horses, and he had slipped out through a service entrance that led to the kitchens and from the kitchens to the yard. In the yard he found Daisy Mormont, who had positioned herself near the inner gate with two of her Bear Island women. "What have you seen?" Jon asked. Daisy's face was grim. "Bolton's men. 20 of them, maybe more. They moved from the east camp to the gatehouse an hour ago. They're wearing mail under their cloaks." "Where?" "In a ward, near the armory, and the Frey garrison has doubled on the walls since sundown. There are crossbowmen in the gallery. I counted at least 6 who aren't holding instruments." Jon's blood went cold. The calculation he had been running in his head since they arrived, the calculation of risk, of probability, of the gap between paranoia and justified caution, resolved into a single clear number. This was not a wedding. This was a trap. "Get to the Blackfish," Jon said. "Tell him to bring the reserve to the east gate. Tell him it's happening now." "Go," Daisy ran. Jon drew the sword he had carried concealed beneath his cloak, not a feast weapon, not a decorative blade, but the castle-forged steel that Mickon had made for him at Winterfell, the sword he had carried at the Whispering Wood and Oxcross and every engagement since, and he moved toward the great hall. Inside the hall, Catelyn saw it begin. The musicians in the gallery stopped playing. The silence that followed was not the natural silence of a pause between songs, but the loaded silence of a mechanism engaging. The final click before a trap springs. One of the musicians set down his instrument and picked up a crossbow that had been lying behind the gallery rail. Catelyn moved. She did not think. Thinking would have cost the half-second that separated action from catastrophe. She seized the nearest pitcher, heavy pewter, full of dark arbor wine, and hurled it at the gallery. The pitcher struck the crossbowman in the chest as he raised the weapon, and the bolt fired wild, burying itself in a ceiling beam instead of in Robb's back. "Arms!" Catelyn screamed. The word, the signal Jon had established with the hidden guardsman, cut through the stunned silence of the hall like a blade through silk. 52 men reached for their concealed weapons. The next 30 seconds were the longest of Catelyn's life. The Frey men at the lower tables drew their own weapons, swords and daggers appearing from beneath the benches where they had been hidden before the feast began. The gallery crossbowmen fired, 3 bolts into the crowd, striking a Manderley knight in the shoulder and a Stark man at arms in the throat, and missing a third target entirely. Tables overturned, wine and food and candlesticks crashed to the floor. The great hall of the twins became a slaughterhouse in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Robb drew his sword. The Gretchen was beside him. The Gretchen, who had been drinking steadily all night and who should have been slow and clumsy with wine. But the Gretchen's tolerance for alcohol was legendary, and he was already on his feet with his greatsword clearing a space around the king before the first Frey soldier reached the high table. "The doors!" Robb shouted. "Hold the doors!" The small Jon Umber reached the hall door and threw it open, and through the door came Greywind, the direwolf launching into the hall with a speed and fury that no man in the room had been prepared for. 600 pounds of grey death striking the first Frey guardsman at the chest and bearing him to the ground and silencing his scream with a single savage motion. The direwolf changed the arithmetic. A hall full of men with swords was a balanced equation. Numbers against numbers, steel against steel. The outcome determined by training and positioning and luck. A hall full of men with swords and a direwolf was not balanced. Greywind moved through the Frey soldiers like a scythe through standing grain, and the panic that followed the direwolf's entrance was the panic of men confronting a predator that their weapons could wound, but not stop, and the panic broke their coordination and their courage simultaneously. Jon reached the hall from the yard entrance. He came through the kitchen door with 20 Stark men behind him, the outer guard he had positioned in the camps, men who had not been drinking, who were in mail and leather, who had been waiting for exactly this signal. They hit the Frey rear like a hammer striking an anvil, and the Frey line. Already fracturing under the direwolf's assault and the unexpected resistance of the armed guests, collapsed, Roose Bolton stood. In the chaos of the hall, amid the screaming and the clashing steel and the spilled wine that was mixing with blood on the stone floor, Roose Bolton stood from his seat at the high table and drew his sword and walked toward Robb with the calm, measured stride of a man who had decided that the chaos was sufficient cover for the single act that would end the war. Catelyn saw him. She saw the pale eyes and the thin lips and the blade that was not raised in defense but held low, angled for a thrust, pointed at the king's unprotected back as Robb fought a Frey knight to his front. She had no weapon in her hands. The knife strapped to her thigh was tangled in the fabric of her gown. She had nothing but her voice and her body and 14 years of protecting the boy who wore the crown. Robb. Behind you. Robb turned. Bolton's thrust, aimed at the kidney, caught Robb's turning hip instead, a glancing wound, a line of red across the leather, rather than the fatal penetration Bolton had intended. Robb's sword came around in a reflexive arc, and Bolton parried, and for 3 exchanges they fought, the boy king and the lord who had sold him to his enemies, until grey wind hit Bolton from the side. The direwolf's jaws closed on Bolton's sword arm. Bolton made no sound. Even as the bones in his forearm cracked and the sword dropped from his nerveless fingers, Roose Bolton made no sound. His face remained as blank and bloodless as it had been when he was drinking water and calculating the timing of the massacre he had planned. "Hold him," Robb commanded. 2 Stark men seized Bolton's arms. Grey wind released his grip and stood between Bolton and the king, the direwolf's muzzle dark with blood, a low growl vibrating through the floor. The fighting lasted another 10 minutes. It ended when the Blackfish, Brynden Tully, who had received Dacey's message and brought 300 mounted men through the east gate, took the inner ward and the gatehouse and the armory where Bolton's mailed reserves had been waiting. The Frey garrison, caught between the Stark forces inside the castle and the Tully cavalry in the yard, surrendered in piecemeal, individuals and small groups throwing down their weapons as the reality of their situation became undeniable. Walder Frey was found in his chambers, behind a locked door, with 2 of his grandsons and a chest of gold that had been packed for travel. He did not resist. He did not speak. He sat in his chair and sucked his gums and watched with the eyes of a very old man who had gambled everything on a single treachery and lost. The cost was not small. 17 Stark men dead. 31 wounded. Dacey Mormont had taken a crossbow bolt through the shoulder and was sitting against the hall's wall with her teeth gritted and the bolt still in her and her Bear Island stubbornness refusing to let her fall. The Small John had a gash across his forehead that bled freely and would scar badly, and that he wore with the Umber family's traditional indifference to personal disfigurement. 3 Frey women had been killed in the crossfire, collateral casualties of a conspiracy their husbands and fathers had built around them, and their deaths would complicate the aftermath in ways that no military victory could clean. And Robb was wounded. The cut on his hip was shallow but long, and it bled steadily, soaking through his tunic and his breeches and dripping onto the stone floor where it mixed with the blood of Freys and Starks and Boltons and became indistinguishable. Catelyn knelt beside him. She pressed cloth to the wound, folded linen from the feast table, white fabric turning red under her hands. She pressed and held, and did not shake, and did not cry, because the time for shaking and crying was later, and now was the time for pressure and cloth and the mechanical business of keeping blood inside a body that needed it. "It's shallow," Robb said. He was pale but composed. The crown was still on his head. He had not lost it in the fighting, a small detail that carried symbolic weight far beyond its practical significance, The king crowned through crisis, the metal holding its position while the world tried to knock it loose. "Don't talk," Catelyn said. "Sit still and don't talk and let me work." Jon appeared. He knelt on Robb's other side, and the two of them, mother and hidden nephew, Tully and Targaryen, the two people who had spent 14 years building a conspiracy of love around this family, worked together in silence, pressing cloth to the wound, keeping the blood where it belonged, holding the king together with their hands. In the gallery above the hall, the dead crossbowmen lay among their instruments. The music had stopped. The feast was over. The Red Wedding, the massacre that would have killed a king and shattered a kingdom and sent the North spiraling into a generation of Bolton tyranny, had become instead the Red Feast that never was. A conspiracy that had been conceived in treachery and built on the assumption that honor meant vulnerability had collided with a family that had learned to be honorable and vigilant simultaneously. And the collision had destroyed the conspiracy rather than the family. The rain continued. It fell on the twins, and on the bodies being carried from the hall, and on the prisoners being led to the cells, and on the river that flowed beneath the bridge, and carried the night south toward a kingdom that did not yet know what had happened and what had been prevented. The realm that remains. The trials took 3 days. Walder Frey was tried first, in his own hall, on his own platform, in the chair where he had dispensed his grudging justice for 70 years. The irony was noted by everyone and commented on by no one, because the solemnity of the proceedings required a dignity that irony would have undermined. Robb presided. He sat in a borrowed chair. He would not sit in Walder's seat, with his crown on his head and his wound bandaged beneath his tunic, and his face holding the expression of a king who was performing the most terrible duty a king could perform, the judgment of a man who had violated the most sacred law of the land. The charges were read by Maester Brennet, the twins' own maester, who had been found in his rookery during the fighting and who had been unharmed, and who recited the charges with the flat, exhausted voice of a man who had served a monster for decades and was not surprised by the monster's final act. Violation of guest right. Conspiracy to commit murder. Conspiracy with a foreign power. The evidence found in Walder's chambers included correspondence with Tywin Lannister, letters in Tywin's own hand that laid out the terms of the arrangement. Bolton would be named Warden of the North, a Frey would marry a Lannister, and the Starks would be eliminated as a political force in exchange for the restoration of Lannister control over the Riverlands. Walder did not defend himself. He sat in his chair, the wrong chair now, the prisoner's seat rather than the judge's, and he sucked his gums and he looked at Robb with the contempt of a man who believed he had been cheated, not by justice but by luck. "You broke your word first," Walder said. "It was the only statement he made during the trial. You promised to marry my daughter. You married a Westerling instead. Everything I did was because of what you did first." Robb looked at him. The boy king's face showed nothing, not anger, not pity, not the satisfaction that some of the northern lords wanted to see. He looked at the old man who had planned his murder, and he saw what Catelyn had taught him to see. Not an enemy, but a consequence. A consequence of broken promises and wounded pride, and the ancient, corrosive belief that power entitled its holder to vengeance. "Lord Walder Frey," Robb said, "you are found guilty of violation of guest right, of conspiracy to murder your king and his lords under your own roof, and of treason against the kingdom of the North and the Riverlands. The sentence is death." Walder sucked his gums one final time. He said. The sound, that trademark vocalization, half laugh and half expectoration, echoed through the hall with a finality that no formal last words could have achieved. The execution was carried out in the yard, by Robb's own hand, with the Valyrian steel blade that had arrived from Riverrun 3 days before, ice. Ned Stark's greatsword, which Catelyn had sent for when the army departed, and which had arrived in the baggage train with the weight and the edge and the history of 8,000 years of Stark justice embedded in its steel. Robb swung the blade the way his father had taught him. Clean, single stroke, the condemned man facing north. Walder Frey died as he had lived, without grace, without dignity, without the redemptive final gesture that stories assign to the deaths of great villains. He was not a great villain. He was a small man with a large grievance, and his death was proportional. Roose Bolton's trial followed. Bolton stood in chains and said nothing. He did not deny the charges. He did not explain his actions. He stood with his pale eyes fixed on a point above Robb's head and his face as blank as fresh parchment. And the blankness was its own confession. The absence of remorse was not defiance but indifference. The philosophical detachment of a man who had weighed the odds and chosen a side and accepted the consequences with the same cold logic that had driven the choice. The evidence against Bolton was extensive. The letters, the positioning of his men, the mail beneath the cloaks, the coordination with the Frey garrison that Dacey Mormont had observed and documented. And beneath the evidence, the deeper pattern, the years of calculated distance, the methodical obedience that concealed methodical disloyalty, the leeches and the flayed men, and the long history of a house whose sigil was a skinned man and whose methods matched their heraldry. Bolton was sentenced and executed on the same day, and his body was sent north to the Dreadfort with a message for his garrison: surrender or burn. Black Walder Frey, the most dangerous of Walder's sons, the one the soldiers called the meanest dog in the kennel, had died in the fighting. Lothar Frey, the architect of the conspiracy's logistics, was captured and executed. The remaining Freys, those who had participated in the plot and those who had merely benefited from belonging to the house that perpetrated it, were sorted with the imperfect justice of wartime. Robb could not kill them all. The Frey family numbered in the hundreds, and most of them were women and children and second sons who had known nothing about the conspiracy and whose guilt was hereditary rather than personal. The twins were forfeit. Robb stripped the castle and the crossing from House Frey and granted it to Olyvar Frey, the young man who had served as Robb's squire and who had been excluded from the conspiracy because his loyalty to Robb was genuine, and because even conspirators recognized that some men could not be turned. Olyvar would hold the twins under the Northern Crown, and the crossing would remain open, and the bridge toll that had funded Walder's spite for 90 years would fund the reconstruction of the Riverlands instead. Catelyn watched the aftermath unfold with the exhausted clarity that followed crisis, the hyper-awareness that combat survivors described, where every detail was vivid and significant and slightly unreal, as though the world had been turned up to a brightness that the eyes could not quite accommodate. She watched Robb govern. He did it well, better than she had expected, better than Ned had done at the same age, because Robb had been forced into kingship at 15 and had no choice but to learn it under pressure. The way metal learned its shape under the hammer. He was fair with the prisoners. He was generous with the surrendered Frey women. He was hard with the co-conspirators, but not cruel. And the distinction between hardness and cruelty was the distinction between a king and a tyrant. And Robb walked the line with a steadiness that made Catelyn proud and terrified simultaneously. Because the steadiness came from a boy who was still growing, and whose growth was being shaped by forces that would either forge a great king or break a good man. She watched Jon. He moved through the aftermath with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent his life learning to be present without being prominent, advising Robb in private, speaking to the lords in corridors rather than councils, managing the logistics of an occupying army while the political work happened above him. The bastard's role. The hidden prince's discipline. Jon was performing both functions with a skill that came from 14 years of preparation, and Catelyn saw in his performance the vindication of every decision she had made since the night Ned told her the truth. The High Valyrian lessons, the Targaryen history, the education that had been designed for a crown and was now being deployed in service of a crown that belonged to someone else. The war continued. It did not end with the twins. Wars did not end with the prevention of a single atrocity, however dramatic. Tywin Lannister was still alive, still in control of the Westerlands and the Crown's armies, still the most dangerous mind in the Seven Kingdoms. The Iron Throne was still held by Joffrey, or by whoever controlled Joffrey, which was Tywin. Sansa was still a hostage. Stannis Baratheon was still pressing his claim from Dragonstone, and his Red Priestess was still burning things and whispering prophecies that no sane person should have listened to, but that Stannis listened to, because Stannis had the zealot's weakness for being told he was chosen. But the war had changed. The Northern Army survived intact. The alliance between the North and the Riverlands survived intact. The Frey crossing was secured. Roose Bolton, the cancer that would have consumed the North from within, was dead, and the Dreadfort surrendered within a month, and the Boltons' forces were absorbed into the Northern Army with the methodical efficiency that Jon organized and Robb authorized. The letter from Tywin arrived a fortnight after the trials. It was addressed to Robb, but Catelyn read it first, because she had been reading Robb's political correspondence since the war began, and because Tywin's letters required a caliber of analysis that was best performed before the emotions of the recipient had a chance to complicate the content. The letter was short. Tywin wrote the way he governed, with economy and precision, and an absence of sentiment that made his threats indistinguishable from his observations. The Red Wedding conspiracy was a Frey initiative, the letter claimed. Tywin's correspondence with Walder had been diplomatic routine, not co-conspiracy. The Crown bore no responsibility for the actions of a vassal house operating outside its instructions. However, the word hung in the text like a blade on a hinge. The Crown recognized that the current conflict served no party's interests. Joffrey was prepared to acknowledge northern independence in exchange for a permanent peace and a trade agreement and the return of Jaime Lannister. Sansa Stark would be returned as a gesture of goodwill. It was a lie, and Catelyn recognized the architecture of the lie the way a stonemason recognized bad masonry, by the gaps. Tywin's letters to Walder Frey, found in Walder's chambers, were not diplomatic routine. They were operational instructions. The terms of the conspiracy, Bolton as warden, a Frey-Lannister marriage, the elimination of the Starks, were written in Tywin's hand with the detail and precision that only a co-architect could provide. Tywin was attempting to salvage the political benefits of the conspiracy without accepting the blame for its failure, and the attempt was clever and brazen and doomed. Because the evidence existed, and Robb possessed it, and the evidence made the letter's central claim provably false. Robb's reply, which Catelyn helped draft and Jon reviewed, was 2 sentences. Send my sister. Then we will discuss terms. The months that followed were the months of consolidation, the unglamorous, essential work of transforming a military victory into a political reality. Robb held court at Riverrun, governing the North and the Riverlands through ravens and messengers and the network of loyal lords that the survival at the Twins had strengthened. The lords who had wavered, and some had wavered, in the dark weeks before the Twins, when the war seemed endless and the king seemed doomed, returned to full loyalty with the zeal of men who had almost backed the wrong horse and were grateful that the right horse was still running. Jon worked in the margins of the kingdom. He travelled north to White Harbour, where Women Manderley was assembling a fleet, to the Dreadfort, where the Bolton surrender needed managing, to Winterfell itself, where the ruins of the castle that Theon had burned stood blackened and broken against the northern sky, and where the reconstruction had begun under the supervision of the mountain clans, who built the way they fought. With blunt determination and an absolute refusal to acknowledge that the task was impossible, he stood in the crypts. The ruins above had been cleared enough to open the passages, and Jon descended alone, carrying a torch, walking past the Stone Kings and Lords of Winter until he reached Lyanna's statue. She was, as he remembered, young, carved in granite, her face holding the sculptor's approximation of beauty that was also sadness, that was also the unknowable interior of a woman who had died at 19, in a tower at the edge of the world. The blue roses that Ned had always placed before her were absent. There was no one to bring them now. No one, except the son she had never held. Jon placed his hand on the stone. The granite was cold, the deep cold of the earth, the permanent chill that lived in the bones of Winterfell and that no fire could fully reach. His mother, his birth mother, the woman who had chosen Rhaegar and chosen love and chosen to build a world that lasted 9 months before it burned. He had 2 mothers, the one in the stone, who had given him blood and a name and a claim to a throne he did not want, and the one above, alive, fierce, unbowed, who had given him 12 years of education and protection and the kind of love that was not instinctive but chosen, not given freely but built stone by stone, day by day, across the years of a childhood that had been constructed as much as experienced. I am Jon, he said to the statue, to the crypt, to the cold air and the stone kings and the history that pressed against him from every direction. I am your son. I am her son. I am Robb's brother. I am Ned Stark's nephew. I am a Targaryen by birth and a Stark by every measure that matters. The torch flickered. The shadows moved. I don't want your throne. The words echoed in the crypt and faded, absorbed by the stone as stone absorbed everything. Heat, sound, grief. The declarations of young men standing before the statues of dead mothers. He did not want the Iron Throne. He had never wanted it, not when Ned told him the truth, not when the crown was at its most theoretical, not when the war made it real and the proof made it possible. The throne was a symbol of a kingdom he had never lived in, built by an ancestor he shared blood with, but not values, defended by a dynasty that had produced madness and greatness in equal measure, and that had ended, rightly, perhaps, in fire and rebellion, and the death of the father he would never meet. Jon was a Stark, not by blood, but by choice, and choice was the only form of identity that he trusted, because blood was an accident, and choice was an act, and acts defined men more than accidents. The conversation with Robb happened at Riverrun, in Hoster Tully's Solar, 3 months after the twins. Hoster was dead by then. The old lord had finally surrendered to the illness that had been consuming him since before the war began. And the Solar belonged to Edmure now, though Edmure used it rarely, spending most of his time at the twins with his new wife and his new responsibilities and the tentative happiness that his marriage to Roslyn had unexpectedly produced. Robb sat behind the desk. Jon stood before it. Catelyn stood by the window. Howland Reed, who had remained at Riverrun through the winter, stood by the door. The Lannisters will learn eventually, Robb said. Someone will talk. Someone always talks. And when they learn that a living Targaryen heir has been hiding in the Northern Army for a year, the calculus changes. Let it change. Jon, I am renouncing the claim. Jon's voice was level. He had rehearsed this, not the words, which were simple, but the delivery, which required a steadiness that the magnitude of the decision made difficult. I am not claiming the Iron Throne. I am not pursuing it. I am not holding it in reserve. I am setting it aside, permanently, publicly, irrevocably. You can't renounce a claim. Claims exist independent of the claimant's desires. You are Rhaegar's son. You are the product of a legal marriage. You are the heir to the Targaryen dynasty. These are facts, and facts don't care about renunciation. Then let the facts stand. Let the world know that Rhaegar's son is alive, and that Rhaegar's son has no interest in the throne his family built and lost. Let them know that the last male Targaryen in Westeros, that anyone knows of, is a Stark in everything but blood, and has chosen the north over the realm. There is a girl across the sea, Catelyn said from the window. Daenerys Targaryen, Viserys' sister. The reports say she has dragons. The word, dragons, sat in the room with the weight of a thing that should not exist and did. If she comes to Westeros, Catelyn continued, she will come with a claim. And your existence, Jon's existence, complicates that claim. He is the son of the elder brother. His claim supersedes hers. Whether he renounces or not, the law is the law, and ambitious men will attempt to use the law to their advantage. Then let them attempt it. I will refuse every attempt. I will refuse publicly, repeatedly, and with whatever legal and political instruments are required to make the refusal permanent. Write it into a document. Have it witnessed. Seal it with the authority of the king in the north and the testimony of Howland Reed and the blessing of every lord who cares to participate. Make it as official as a renunciation can be. Robb studied his brother. The anger from the revelation, the betrayal, the 12 years of lies had faded into something more complex and more durable. An understanding that the lies had been told out of love, and that love conducted through deception was imperfect but not false, and that the imperfection was the price of survival in a world that punished honesty with the same enthusiasm with which it punished treason. You are sure. I have never been more certain of anything. You are giving up a kingdom. I am keeping a family. The words landed in the room and settled there, and no one contradicted them, because no one could. The choice was Jon's, the only choice that had ever been entirely his. The first decision of his life that was not shaped by the secret or the secret's keepers or the demands of a world that wanted to assign him an identity he had not chosen. He was choosing. He was choosing Robb. He was choosing the North. He was choosing Catelyn, who was not his mother by blood, but who was his mother by every act of will and courage and sacrifice that the word contained. Howland Reed spoke last. Your father would have understood. Which one? Jon asked, and the question held no bitterness, only the wry recognition of a man who had inherited two legacies and was honoring both by choosing the one that matched the man he had become. The document was drawn up by Maester Vyman and signed by Jon, and witnessed by Robb and Catelyn and Howland Reed, and the lords of the North who were present at Riverrun. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name, true-born son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, heir to the Iron Throne by the laws of succession, formally and permanently renounced his claim to the Targaryen dynasty, and all titles, lands, and authorities associated with that claim. He swore fealty to Robb Stark, king in the North, and accepted the title that Robb offered in return, Lord of Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress that guarded the Neck, and that the Starks had never bothered to rebuild because they had never needed it, and that they now needed desperately. Because the Neck was the gateway between the North and the South, and the gateway required a guardian that the kingdom could trust without reservation. Moat Cailin, the fortress of the first men, the place where the children of the forest had tried to shatter the continent to stop the Andal invasion. Jon would rebuild it. He would hold it. He would stand at the border between the world he had chosen and the world he had rejected, and the standing would be its own statement, the hidden prince become the Northern Guardian. The Targaryen heir become the Stark shield. Catelyn watched the signing from the back of the room. She stood in the shadows, deliberately, because the moment belonged to Jon and Robb and the kingdom they were building together, and her role in it was the role she had always played, the architect who worked in silence, the builder who laid foundations that others stood on, the woman who had taken a secret and turned it into a family, and had held the family together through 12 years of deception and 1 year of war, and a betrayal that should have destroyed everything, but instead had made everything stronger. She was 44 years old. Her hair had gone grey at the temples. Her hands, which had held babies and knives and bandages and the bleeding wound in Robb's side at the twins, showed the wear of a life that had demanded more from them than any reasonable life should demand. She was tired. She was proud. She was terrified for Sansa, who was still in King's Landing, still a hostage, still a piece on a board that Tywin Lannister was rearranging. She was grieving for Ned, always for Ned, the grief a permanent resident in her chest that she had learned to live around but never learned to live without. She was hopeful, for the first time since the Raven from King's Landing carried the news of Ned's death. She was hopeful, and the hope was fragile and new and painful in the way that all new growth was painful, pushing through ground that had been frozen and breaking the ice with the blind, stubborn force of life refusing to accept that winter was permanent. Her sons were alive, both of them, the son of her blood and the son of her choice. Bran and Rickon too. The reports from the north said they had escaped Winterfell, had been sheltered by loyalists, had survived Theon's occupation and its aftermath, and were safe, somewhere, in the vast white landscape of a north that was rebuilding itself around them. Her family was intact, broken in places, scarred in others, missing the pieces that war had taken and that no victory could return. Ned, always Ned, the absence that anchored all the other absences. But intact, functioning, held together by the decisions she had made in a dark room 12 years ago, when a man she loved told her a secret she had not asked for, and she chose to carry it. Jon found her that evening, in the Godswood at Riverrun. The Godswood was not northern. It held no weirwood, no heart tree with a carved face, only a tall oak that Hoster Tully had planted when Catelyn was a child, and that had grown, over the decades, into a broad, steady presence that was not sacred, but was old enough to feel like it should be. "It's done," Jon said. "I know," He stood beside her. The light was failing, the sun dropping behind the western hills, the river catching the last of it and throwing it back as a long gold streak across the water. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke and the distant clean cold that came down from the north, and that meant winter was not here yet, but was on its way. "Thank you," Jon said. "For what? For 12 years. For the lessons and the languages and the cold mornings when you made me sit in the library when I wanted to be in the yard. For the lie you told every day of your life so that I could live. For looking at me, a baby you had every reason to hate, and choosing to love me anyway." Catelyn's throat tightened. She did not speak. The words he was saying were the words she had imagined hearing for 12 years. The acknowledgement, the gratitude, the recognition that the sacrifice had been seen and understood and valued. She had imagined them 1,000 times. She had not imagined that hearing them would feel like this, not triumphant, not vindicated, but simply true. Simply the final settling of an account that had been open for too long and that could now be closed. "You were worth it," she said. "Every day of it, every lie, every cold morning, every moment of terror that someone would discover the truth. You were worth it, Jon." He took her hand. She let him. They stood in the godswood that was not a godswood, under a tree that was not a heart tree. In a castle that was not their home, and the silence between them was not empty, but full. Full of the history they shared, and the future they had fought for, and the love that had been built, brick by brick, across the years of a childhood that began with a lie and ended with a truth. The North endured. The war continued in the South, Tywin maneuvering, Stannis burning, the Tyrells calculating. The kingdom fragmenting along the fault lines that Robert's death and Cersei's ambition had exposed. Sansa remained a hostage, and the effort to retrieve her would be the next chapter, the next crisis, the next test of the family that Catelyn had built and defended and held together with nothing but her will and the promise she had made to a man who had trusted her with the most dangerous secret in the world. But tonight, in this moment, in this borrowed godswood, with the river running south, and the sky turning dark, and the first stars appearing above the hills like scattered sparks from a fire that the gods had lit and left burning, the family was whole. Damaged, but whole. Scarred, but standing. Alive, against every odd, against every conspiracy, against every force that had tried to tear them apart. Alive. Catelyn looked north, somewhere beyond the hills and the rivers and the miles that separated her from the home she had married into and made her own. Winterfell was being rebuilt. Stone by stone, wall by wall, the castle rising from its ashes the way the family had risen from its grief, the way the North had risen from the war. It would take years. The walls would not look the same. The stones would carry the scars of the burning, and the scars would remain long after the reconstruction was finished, built into the structure as reminders of what had been endured and what had been survived. That was all right. Scars were not flaws. Scars were evidence. Evidence that the wound had been real, and that the body had healed, and that the healing had produced something that was not the same as what had existed before, but was not lesser. Was, perhaps, stronger, in the way that broken bones knit thicker and that rebuilt walls incorporated the lessons of the siege that broke them. She let go of Jon's hand. She wiped her eyes. She turned from the godswood and walked back toward the castle, where Robb was waiting, and where the ravens were coming, and where the next crisis was already forming on the horizon, because crises did not stop forming simply because you had survived the last one. She walked with her back straight and her chin up and her eyes clear, the way she had walked for 12 years, the way she would walk for as long as the walking was required of her. The woman who had chosen, the mother who had stayed, the lie that had loved them all,